that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is for you. That's how YouTube keeps sending you stories like this. And now let's get into it. I spent the best years of my youth in a semi-isolated mountain settlement called Greenwood, located in the far reaches of Oregon. During the 2 decades I lived there, those parts witnessed only 2 events that broke their stagnation. The first event, which was undoubtedly the most joyful, was my coming into this world. And I suppose your hearts are overflowing with gratitude right now. However, the second event, which sits upon the throne of nightmares in our history, was when a young boy named Liam Coulter caused the destruction of the chemical and pesticide cellar belonging to his grandfather's farm. Or rather, to be strictly accurate, what Liam committed represented the ultimate atrocity that our settlement miraculously survived. If the connections in this paradox seem confusing to you, listen to me patiently, for all the tangled threads will unfold and become clear in the following lines. It was a cold Friday night in the autumn of 2012. I was taking my first steps in middle school. It was that age when my friends and I would seize any opportunity to go out on foot to explore the woods adjacent to the town. Just miserable boyish adventures that knew nothing of the falseness of technology. We were wandering through the tree-lined paths when we spotted a girl from our class, named Emma, running in the opposite direction, trembling with terror. She stopped us, catching her breath with great difficulty, and cried out to us with wide eyes, "Oh my God, run." The Coulter family cellar is exploding, and strange gases are rising from it. Driven by overwhelming curiosity, we rushed in the opposite direction of her flight, cutting through the wooded path until we found ourselves in front of a raging furnace of green and orange flames devouring what used to be known as the farm cellar. As soon as we arrived at the outer perimeter, we were confronted by the environmental security forces and anxious rescue workers, who immediately forced us to retreat a great distance. We thought we were standing in a completely safe spot, which left us stunned and confused, but we obeyed orders and fell back. At that exact moment, sharp cracking sounds and successive chemical pressure explosions echoed from the depths of the earth. We saw the firefighters, who were trying to contain the gases, suddenly rush back and retreat behind their armored vehicles for cover. I did not realize the nature of the materials causing these miniature chemical explosions, but I reasoned that if this danger struck terror into the hearts of mass professionals, then I certainly had every right to panic. I believed the toxic gases would turn the farm into a destructive testing ground, and my friends shared the same thoughts. We did not hesitate to flee the scene, running toward our homes to tell our families the details of what we had witnessed. On Saturday morning at the Educational Institute, there was no talk among the students louder than the farm fire, and the biggest driver of that commotion was Liam Coulter's sudden disappearance and total absence from sight. Rumors began to scatter like wildfire. Some boys claimed they saw the state ambulance transporting him under heavy guard, his body disfigured by the searing gases and turned into something resembling a charred skeleton. Meanwhile, others circulated a narrative that the authorities had forcibly relocated him and his parents to live in a government housing complex because the emitted chemicals had rendered their area a contaminated zone unfit for life. A narrative I was inclined to believe, thinking that any casualties would have been followed by an immediate official statement. But by Sunday morning, the shocking truth emerged. Local newspapers published a report stating that rescue teams had pulled a single charred body from the ruins of the underground cellar, while the remaining members of the family had been transferred to a private clinic under security protection, with their plea to the media to respect their privacy. Thus, we knew that death had claimed his soul, but the identity remained a mystery, especially since the Coulter family home housed 3 generations of relatives, and Liam was one of several grandchildren living in the same compound. Speculations and fictional tales multiplied in the town, and we obtained no concrete certainty until the following day, when the dean of the institute summoned us to the Grand Theater for an emergency, closed-door meeting. The image of the entire institute pouring into the theater hall remains etched in my memory. The county investigator and 2 federal assistants stood in their dark official uniforms in front of the podium. their faces masked with stern solemnity. Once we settled into our seats, the dean began by noting that the investigator carried news of great importance and gravity concerning our small community. When the investigator stepped forward and removed his sunglasses, I swear the silence that enveloped the hall was enough to hear a pin drop. We knew the matter concerned the Coulter family, but the nature of the surprise was beyond the imagination of any of us, even if we live for an entire lifetime. I will not claim to convey his words with literal precision, as nearly 14 years have passed since that incident, but the essence of his announcement was as follows. Students, you have all heard the news of the contamination and fire at the Coulter facility, and you have learned of the tragic loss of a life. Well, I regret to be the bearer of this tragedy, but it was your classmate Liam who perished in that cellar. A violent wave of gasps and terrified murmurs rippled through the rows of students. The investigator waited for a few seconds for the noise to subside before continuing. The investigation is still underway to determine the primary cause of the chemical ignition, so we urge anyone who had contact with Liam or possesses any piece of information, no matter how small, to bring it forward to us. Not necessarily right now. You can contact my office confidentially to ensure your privacy. Please, if you noticed any suspicious behavior or unusual habits displayed by Liam recently, do not hesitate to let us know. That appeal was the first thread that alerted us that the disaster went beyond a mere accident. I think the authorities wanted to manage the situation with extreme caution, using velvet gloves so as not to scratch our childish feelings or drive us to panic over the truth they possessed. The prevailing impression among us was shock mingled with grief. How could a classmate die in such a terrifying way underground? But I am absolutely certain that if the security personnel had revealed to us at that moment the nature of what they had found beneath the rubble, the grief would have vanished instantly, replaced by rampant anger and disgust. It took another 48 hours for the naked truth to manifest, and by then, the local authorities chose to delegate the parents to inform the children of the tragedy. A closed town meeting for parents was held at the town hall. I remember that day, well, because my parents ordered me to finish cleaning the garden and tidying the rooms before their return, but I took advantage of their absence to waste time recklessly playing video games for 2 continuous hours. Upon hearing the sound of their car, fear gripped me that they would scold me because I had not made a single move toward the required chores. But to my surprise, they did not care about the garden at all. Their features bore a strange mixture of grimness, sadness, and sharp, piercing looks. The exact same expressions I saw on them the day my grandmother was suddenly struck by her terminal illness. My father asked me to sit in the living room and began asking about the nature of my relationship with Liam. I replied that it was extremely superficial. We were merely lab partners in science class and had never shared a personal conversation. Then, a stream of strange questions poured down on me. Had Liam ever shown hostility toward me? Was he suffering from isolation? Did he hate anyone in the settlement? Ultimately, I grew tired of the ambiguity and told them frankly that the questions indicated their knowledge of a dangerous secret, and I prefer that they tell me directly if the boy had ended his own life, as I was no longer a child and could handle it. But the days proved that I was not mature enough to receive that shock. Liam had not ended his life out of despair. Rather, he had accidentally caused his own death while attempting to assemble a highly destructive incendiary explosive. The data indicated that he was trying to prepare a miniature test version to check the combustion formula. But while mixing the chemical components, a mistake in the proportions caused an immediate reaction that led to a massive pressure explosion, killing him in a fraction of a second before the flames expanded to consume the entire cellar. Initially, the security agencies thought he was just a boy suffering from an obsession with fires and destruction, and that he was tampering with aviation fuel or something similar. This explains the days it took for the forensic laboratory investigations to reach certainty. The experts had to sift through the ash meticulously and examine his personal computer and remaining belongings in his room to understand the motives. Here, investigators stumbled upon a secret, encrypted diary that Liam used to record the details of his grand plan, building a massive explosive device and planting it beneath the town's conference hall on a Friday morning, at the exact time when hundreds of residents and their families gathered to attend regular events. The authorities did not reveal the details of the rest of the diary, merely describing it as a reading that makes one's skin crawl and induces nausea, and that it included explicit references and extensive praise for the perpetrators of famous school massacres from past decades. My mother burst into tears by the end of the story, while in my father's eyes, I saw a terror and shakiness that I had never known in his strong personality. That boy, with whom we used to share the hallways, was planning to erase our entire settlement from existence. Let me assure you, had he succeeded in executing his plan and detonating the hall during the annual autumn festival, he would have wiped out 90% of the town's clans and residents in a single flash of fire. All we got as an analysis of his behavior was that he carried a black malice and wanted to hurt human beings, or that his mind was sick and deformed. None of us bullied him or tightened the noose around him at the Institute. He lived quietly, but he was a madman harboring destructive thoughts. With all that horror, I lift my hands in gratitude to the heavens that his short-sightedness and lack of chemical expertise prevented him from completing his research accurately, and that he did not exercise enough caution during mixing. Had he possessed greater intelligence, our town today would be nothing but a black pit of ash, completely erased from the face of the earth. The truth I am about to unveil today is the darkest secret ever etched into my memory. I come from a remote farming settlement on the fringes of New South Wales, Australia. In that barren expanse, there stands a small, old farmhouse built of grey stone. Behind that isolated structure rises a deserted stone cellar with an iron roof, officially designated as a memorial for a family of 4 who were allegedly murdered in a raid by mysterious bandits. Criminals who ravaged the land and were never brought to justice. The official story claimed that the peace of their lives vanished on a winter night when the invaders caught them sound asleep, claiming the lives of the entire family. The wife, the husband, and the 2 children, in a swift chronological sequence, with only minutes separating one victim from the next. As expected, that tragedy left deep scars on the souls of the settlement's inhabitants. I was only in primary school when it happened, but the scenes of the silent candlelight vigil, the funeral service, and the speeches delivered at the unveiling of the memorial plaque in the cellar remain permanently burned into my mind. The matter was marketed to the public as an entirely random, treacherous tragedy, a heinous crime committed against our peaceful community by an elusive evil from beyond the borders. However, the falsehood lies precisely in those details. The reality that everyone covered up is an open secret, a truth passed down among the residents in cautious whispers, with no one daring to utter it aloud. The reason for this secrecy, as they later taught me, was the desire to preserve social peace and protect the settlement's reputation. But to this day, I do not understand how a fortress of lies can truly protect a community. It is merely a flimsy mask covering the distorted face of our town's reality. What is the point of counterfeiting peace and pretending we live in an oasis of happiness while reality bleeds with something far darker? Well, I suppose I have kept you hanging on the threads of suspense for too long, so I will get straight to the core of what happened on that accursed night. The family members ate a standard dinner and sat sharing conversations around the fireplace. Shortly before 10 p.m., the mother accompanied her 2 children to their bedrooms on the upper floor. The patriarch of the family usually stayed up late by himself, enjoying a cup of bitter coffee after everyone else had gone to sleep, flipping through wilderness hunting magazines, and checking the weather and agricultural news, the traditional rituals of men from that era. However, on that night, he never left his comfortable wooden chair. The cover story that spread claimed the family members were slaughtered while in their beds, and biologically speaking, this is true. But the scene was always painted as if they were all deeply enveloped in peaceful, innocent sleep before the hand of death caught them by surprise. But that is an absolute fabrication. A few hours before the tragedy, the family had gathered around the dinner table. I do not recall the exact ingredients of the main dish. Perhaps it was a beef stew or something similar, but I am fully aware of the dessert that concluded the meal. The family's youngest daughter, who was 10 years old, had taken it upon herself to prepare a raspberry-flavored gelatin dessert that afternoon. In my mind, that dessert probably wasn't the best-made thing in the world. And my God, if my child showed a passion for cooking, I would have devoured the entire plate, pretending to be thrilled and grateful. What does it matter if the powder ratio was slightly off or the amount of extra sugar was overwhelming, as long as the goal was to encourage her? However, the secret behind the strange taste of that dessert was not the girl's lack of experience. Rather, it was because the 10-year-old child had emptied an entire bottle of a powerful liquid sedative compound into the gelatin mixture before serving it. I do not know for certain the exact amount she slipped in, nor how much of the dessert the parents and her older brother consumed, but it was enough to plunge them into a total, medically induced coma, paving the way for the little girl to put her dark plan into motion. Do you see the paradox now? The reason the authorities never caught the mysterious, murderous drifter who randomly broke into the house is because there was no external intruder that night whatsoever. Once the little girl made sure her family was completely unconscious, she crept toward the kitchen and drew a long, serrated knife from the utensil holder. She walked quietly down to the living room where her father was lying in a deep slumber on the wooden chair and plunged the knife into his throat. Based on the whispered accounts, she severed his neck with a cut so deep and wide that it stripped him of any ability to cry out for help. All he could manage to do was press his hands against the wound, his eyes wide with shock and question as to why, before his soul departed his body within a few fleeting minutes. Following that, she climbed the wooden stairs toward the upper floor and repeated the act with her mother and brother, tearing their throats open while they succumbed to the sedation in their beds. All of this happened on a Wednesday night, by the way, and not a single soul in the settlement suspected anything until Friday morning when the family failed to attend the weekly farmers' meeting. Even then, people assumed their absence was due to personal reasons. Perhaps they had taken a sudden trip to visit relatives in the city or were busy fixing a breakdown on the farm. Furthermore, our town is of that variety where everyone looks into their neighbor's business, yet they adhere to strict boundaries that prevent them from directly interfering in the private affairs of others. The point is, no one set foot across the threshold of that house until Monday afternoon, approximately 120 hours after the massacre took place. The children did not show up for class, and the parents failed to register their presence in the fields. From what I understand, the law enforcement officers spent the entire morning connecting clues and conducting inquiries until they deduced that the whole family had vanished under mysterious circumstances. Naturally, the first destination for the search was their residence, so two of the investigators' deputies set off to check on them. What those two men witnessed inside the house remains a matter of intense dispute and sharp division among the settlement's residents. Depending on who you listen to, one of three scenarios brought about the end. The first hypothesis claims that the 10-year-old daughter ended her own life inside the house after awakening from the fog of her guilt and realizing the sheer atrocity of the crime she had committed. Later, the entire matter was covered up simply to avoid the media circus and painful judicial investigations that would accompany a case of this magnitude. This is the most oversimplified explanation, and I know logical reasoning pushes us to believe it, but I personally do not favor it. I can understand the motives that led the elders to hush up the crime. Leaking a tragedy like this to the media would rip apart the social fabric of a small settlement like ours. But human sins occur at rates far higher than we care to admit, and news eventually leaks out, no matter how much time passes. So, what was so uniquely hideous and disturbing about this case? I mean, miles worse than the previous details of the murder that drove the residents to enforce an absolute wall of silence. For instance, in my case right now, I believe I'm the first person who dares to recount these matters to an outsider. Yet, the culture of secrecy that seems to have woven itself into our genes prevents me from revealing the real names, the exact dates, or the geographical locations to you by name. This is because all the legal consequences, from judicial prosecution to potential prison sentences for withholding information, would fall squarely on my shoulders alone. But let us return to the scenarios that I believe touch upon actual reality. The first alternative theory suggests that when the police broke into the house, the little girl pretended to be the sole survivor of the alleged attack, luring the deputies to come closer before suddenly lunging to attack them. The officers tried to control her and disarm her, but she was clinging to the very knife she used to end her family's lives. In the ensuing chaos and confusion, a bullet discharged from one of their pistols, ending her life. This is what a sector of the population believes. It is undoubtedly the least shocking hypothesis, but it doesn't make much sense to me. It is possible to believe the story of a terrified rookie cop pulling the trigger to protect himself upon seeing the weapon, but being unable to restrain a 10-year-old girl without resorting to killing? Honestly, I don't think so. None of the people promoting this narrative were near the house at the time to confirm hearing the sound of gunfire. And whether the officer was panicked or not, I refuse to believe they would refrain from calling an ambulance after shooting a child. Once official county paramedics are on the scene, any chance of a cover-up vanishes due to the tons of official paperwork that must be filed. And here emerges the second alternative theory, the one that explains why no medical crews were summoned, because everyone was already a cold corpse before the police ever stepped foot across the threshold. None of the neighbors caught a glimpse of the girl throughout the weekend, which means she never left the house to get supplies or go to town. So, how did she live those days and what caused her demise? According to some whispered accounts, the answer to these two questions carries details of supreme resistance and disgust. And worst of all, it represents the exact same answer. The 10-year-old girl passed away as a result of attempting to bite and consume parts of her dead father's corpse. She died because her body could not withstand the bacterial poisoning resulting from consuming the corpse, which caused a severe and fatal gastrointestinal illness that left her unable to retain any fluids in her system, including water. I am no forensic expert to determine the precise cause of death. Perhaps it was rapid, acute dehydration, but by the time the deputy smashed open the back door of the house on Monday afternoon, the little girl had perished, lying in a puddle of her own bodily fluids and vomit. It is a highly suspicious coincidence that both officers who discovered the bodies resigned and left the county permanently shortly after the incident. Now, the only two witnesses to the truth have packed their bags and departed, leaving no way to track them or communicate with them. But at the same time, I can understand how two young officers raised in a simple rural environment could not bear the weight of the scene that forced itself upon their eyes that day. If the last theory is truly correct, witnessing something like that is enough to shatter anyone's mental equilibrium and drive them completely mad. As you can imagine, this conversation is not the kind I can have with just anyone. My childhood friends and I would exchange words about it in high school from time to time, but always in hushed, whispered tones, away from public spaces out of fear that the elders' ears might intercept us. Now that my parents have departed this world and I reside in another distant province, I do not possess the ability to return to the settlement and begin digging up the past and asking questions. They would confront me with the exact same impregnable wall of silence encountered by anyone who tries to investigate what happened. They would shake their heads, saying, "A horrible tragedy befell that family. What a pitiful matter. We hope justice finds the perpetrator one day." Then, in a matter of years, when the last person carrying the truth in their chest passes away, those comfortable lies they crafted around the incident will turn into the only official version of reality. And all that evil that permeated the soul of a little girl will be obliterated and simply forgotten. And maybe, just maybe, that is the best outcome things should come to. My family's memory holds the deed to our old summer cottage, a rustic, isolated structure built from dark eucalyptus timber, perched on the edge of a forgotten coastal village called Strider in the Australian province of Tasmania. This small house represents a deeply rooted historical tie for our clan, and perhaps it is this emotional passion for the past that has made us cling to its walls and reject the idea of ever putting it up for sale. However, there is another motive behind this stubborn preservation, a motive born of a tale steeped in mystery and intense tension associated with this place. A stranger listening to it might view it as a mere piece of dramatic fiction, but for my elderly Aunt Helen, it was the living embodiment of pure horror that she witnessed with her own senses. The events of that incident date back to the winter of 1974, long before I was born, and my aunt was spending a few weeks in that wooden house entirely by herself. Her husband had passed away before that era, but in the past, with the arrival of winter each year, they used to isolate themselves there for nearly half a month, escaping the bustle of life and content with the company of the owls that inhabited the tops of the surrounding trees. After death took him, Helen continued to revive this annual ritual as a personal means to cope with the bitter loss and amend her broken spirit. This was what brought her to be completely alone in that remote haven during the month of July, 1974. In that era, the house did not contain any device for broadcasting images. Instead, she warded off her loneliness with an old radio receiver, catching classic dramatic plays over the airwaves of a local station that has since vanished from existence. That broadcasting platform, like other channels of the ether, would interrupt its entertainment from time to time to relay urgent security updates. One afternoon, a news bulletin caught her attention, speaking of consecutive robberies and armed heists targeting banks in the provinces of Victoria and South Australia. The announcer explained that security agencies had identified a primary suspect they wished to question, but he had managed to evade them, slipping through checkpoint lines. Reports indicated the probability of his hiding in the mountainous brush of his birthplace, and, as you guessed, the island of Tasmania. The spokesperson followed up with a brief description of the fugitive: tall, heavily built, possessing thick blonde hair and dark brown eyes, noting that his name was Jonathan Vance. My aunt still remembers how that name stuck in her imagination, not because of its strangeness, but because the rhythm of the letters perfectly matched the name of a villain in an old detective novel she had read in her youth. She found herself whispering those words with an anxious hum, even though reading crime stories on isolated winter nights is considered an omen of bad luck among rural folk. The evening hours passed heavily, and the sun sank behind the hills, leaving a pitch-black darkness. My aunt was relaxing by the hearth, immersed in knitting wool as old women usually do. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the sound of violent, successive knocks on the wooden door of the house. She was not expecting a visit from anyone, especially since the nearest farmer resided 2 full kilometers away down the rugged road. Therefore, she rose from her chair and advanced toward the entrance with slowed steps, torn by an entirely justified feeling of suspicion and stern apprehension. When she opened the door, a tall man materialized before her, wearing a winter leather coat with a dark woolen cap resting on his head. He had sharp brown eyes and a thick blonde mustache. Because my aunt was naturally inclined to aid travelers and offer warm hospitality, she took the initiative to greet him and wished him a warm night, asking him about his need. He replied in a calm tone, "Good evening, gracious lady. I apologize deeply for knocking on your door at this late hour, but I found you to be my last resort to ask for a simple favor." He went on to explain that he owned a small plot of land in the adjacent area and had come to inspect its fence. However, a breakdown had struck his car engine as the light faded, and given that he had set off in a hurry after finishing his work, he had forgotten to pack provisions, leaving him without food in this freezing cold. According to my aunt's description, the man overflowed with immense politeness and sobriety of expression, to the point that she felt safe with him. Guided by her spontaneous instinct, she invited him inside without deeply contemplating the consequences. Helen was accustomed to keeping her kitchen cabinets packed with canned foods and dehydrated goods in anticipation of weather conditions, so she had more than enough to exceed her needs by far. She said she was standing at the counter, filling the man's backpack with pieces of jerky and dried figs, when their eyes suddenly met and she stopped moving. She said to him in an inquisitive tone, "We haven't been introduced yet. What is your name, son?" He replied without hesitation, "My name is Thomas, ma'am." She asked, seeking clarification, "Thomas what?" The man replied with steadfastness, "Thomas Vance." "Vance." She said that word echoed like a thunderbolt through the recesses of her mind, detonating an alarm bell in her consciousness. The name wasn't Jonathan exactly, but the family route was identical in a terrifying way, a match close enough to let nausea and constriction gnaw at her entrails. Keep in mind that this incident took place in a time entirely devoid of wireless communication or mobile phones, and the rural house was not connected to a landline network. The only external line of defense available to my aunt was an old hunting rifle mounted in the hallway, and if the situation was as bad as she imagined, attempting to reach the rifle might only hasten her demise. Therefore, my aunt preferred to feign calmness and play the card of ignorance. She realized with her sharp wit that humoring him, granting him the provisions, and letting him depart in peace was the only path that would enable her to drive her car toward the town at sunrise to inform the police of her visitor's true identity. However, at the moment she intended to bid him farewell politely, wishing him safety on his way, he turned to her and said coldly, "In fact, there's another wish I hope you will not deny me. Does your house have room for a small spot where I could lean and rest my head from the exhaustion of this freezing cold tonight?" My aunt describes that moment as a silent confrontation that froze the blood in her veins. She stared into Thomas's eyes and glimpsed in them a flash of wild desperation, ready to explode at any refusal. She exerted every ounce of composure she possessed to maintain her steady tone, saying, "I am sorry, son. The house is narrow, and I do not have an extra mattress to spare." At that, the man's hand moved slowly toward the inside pocket of his leather coat, drawing a black pistol. He said in a low tone, "I'm very sorry. I truly hope you wouldn't push me to such a choice." Then he pointed the barrel of the weapon inward and added warningly, "Please, do not make me resort to force." For anyone who hasn't deduced the truth yet, the person sitting in her living room was not Thomas Vance, nor did he have any connection to any false name he gave her to throw dust in her eyes. The man who commandeered the warmth of her home that night was none other than Jonathan Vance himself, the mastermind and #1 wanted fugitive in the armed robbery and bank assassination cases that shook the provinces. My aunt mentioned that those hours were the most terrifying experience in the course of her life, but for a reason completely different from what might spring to mind. She repeatedly assured me that she did not feel a crushing fear of the idea of death. She had stepped toward her mid-70s at the time, and she had long since set her soul right with the Creator and reconciled with the idea of passing away. Instead, the true locus of horror was embodied in how strangely normal and profoundly simple this criminal's behavior was. Even after the metaphorical mask fell and his identity was exposed, the man maintained his politeness and calmness with her. He even offered with all friendliness to help her gather firewood and light the hearth in the early morning. Of course, she showed him that she was entirely capable of managing her affairs on her own, and she certainly did not want the security forces to think later that she had been complicit or satisfied with his staying. Yet, he did not possess that hysterical countenance or the deformed features that the imagination paints for out-of-control criminals after listening to radio police reports. She used to say that the only indicator that subtly hinted at the reality of his dark mind surfaced when they sat together to eat the improvised dinner, and he recited a short phrase of grace before reaching for the food. She did not remember the exact text of his words, except that he focused on a concept to the effect that harsh purification brings about justice in the end. This was a man who had shot bank guards and terrorized entire families. So it was logical that his talk of justice and purification struck her with a cold shiver and a profound disgust that rippled through her depths. My God, the mere thought of sitting with someone like that at one table makes my body shudder. I'm certain the food would have choked in my throat. Therefore, it will not be surprising to learn that my aunt barely touched her plate, eating only enough to keep her alive, and she did not taste sleep at all that night, except in fitful, terrified dozes. She lay upon her bed while Jonathan took to the floor, leaning against his coat. The entire time she strained her ears, expecting to suddenly hear the roar of police car engines and see security searchlights dispel the darkness of the windows, turning the homestead into an open siege ground. But none of that materialized. No security force appeared. It seems that sheer exhaustion finally overcame her in the final stretch of the night, for she awoke suddenly to the first rays of dawn filling the room, only to find that Jonathan's presence had completely vanished from the place. She said that from the sheer fatigue and psychological exhaustion left behind by that night, she wandered around the house for a second, wondering if everything she had lived through was just a heavy nightmare manufactured by her subconscious. But the doubt vanished completely when she found a small piece of paper resting on the kitchen table, written in pencil in his handwriting, saying simply, "Grateful for your deed. May fate protect you." Only then did she know that the horror was real. I understand completely that this tale does not follow the traditional pattern of usual horror stories. Despite my aunt's forced sharing of her roof with a true, hunted predator, I do not think she was facing an imminent danger of being killed that night. Perhaps if she had shown resistance or attempted to betray him by taking advantage of his distraction, he would have forced her to look upon his murderous face and would have harmed her. But she was an elderly woman, and she did not represent any military or security threat to his movements. He knew with certainty that the cottage was completely isolated from communication networks. Had it not been for this total isolation, he would not have risked appearing there in the first place. She framed it herself. She did not fear death, and she sensed somehow that he would not spill her blood without cause. But just like her feeling, the thing that makes me and my sister shudder whenever we recall the details of my aunt's close experience is how normal and composed that killer appeared in his external demeanor. We always tend in our imagination to depict terrorists and hardened criminals as hideous monsters, with demons flying from their eyes, living their days in the dungeons of malice and excessive brutality. This depiction undoubtedly applies to some of them. But the gripping idea, which confirms that the most evil and cruel of humans can be completely like us, speaking politely and possessing entirely normal features, is the most terrifying idea to my soul. The northernmost edges of the fog-shrouded Canadian province of Nova Scotia hold a rocky island, home to a small town bearing a forgotten historical name. In the colonial era, this isolated spot was known as Port Royal, but it officially changed its name in the winter of 1934 after an eccentric British investor pledged to build the largest shipyard in North America, on the sole condition that the town be named after his favorite warship. Thus, the residents renamed it Ironheart. At the time, the town was home to only 3,200 farmers and sailors, and this number saw no sudden spikes for decades, growing only sluggishly with the birth of new generations. However, at the turn of the 1990s, specifically between 1992 and 1998, a mysterious demographic depression struck the town, causing hundreds of fishermen to pack their belongings and abandon their homes for the inland provinces without any declared reason. What lay behind this mass exodus and flight from such a beautiful land? The suppressed truth points an accusing finger toward an old man who owned an isolated lumber mill, named Arthur Vance Graham. Arthur was born on January 4th, 1921, in the mountainous town of Truro, and he and his younger sister, Eileen, grew up under the care of their sharp-tempered paternal grandfather after their mother abandoned them. Their father was a coarse fisherman who emptied his rage onto his two children whenever his nets returned empty, often visiting them in the cabin in a state of complete intoxication. Arthur recalled a winter night when his father gifted him an old book containing complex, gruesome anatomical drawings of medieval torture methods. Because Arthur craved the affection of his absent father, he viewed that book as a sacred relic and began poring over its pages with a morbid fascination until he became possessed by a bizarre fixation that the only way to earn his late father's approval was to master the art of controlling and completely subjugating the bodies of others. These dark thoughts inflicted deep fractures upon adolescent Arthur's personality, rendering him incapable of forming standard friendships or exchanging conversation with his peers at St. Jude Vocational School. This social isolation doubled the severity of the ridicule and cruel persecution he endured at the hands of the town's youth, anchoring a fierce desire for hidden revenge deep within his soul. Upon reaching adulthood, Arthur joined the Merchant Navy and worked as a maintenance technician in the heavy engine rooms before being discharged for health reasons. During those years, Arthur entered into marriage and failed 5 consecutive times. And though he kept the reasons for his divorce a secret, it was clear to everyone that he possessed a withered soul incapable of emotional giving or adapting to a woman's presence in his life. In the period following his final divorce, which witnessed a complete collapse of his psychological stability, Arthur underwent a dangerous behavioral shift. He spent his life savings, which exceeded $150,000, to reconstruct a secret basement beneath his lumber mill, which he referred to in his journals as the Obedience Cell. The Obedience Cell was a fortified subterranean room that looked from above like an ordinary spare parts storeroom, but its core was the manifestation of a true nightmare. Graham spent his fortune completely lining the walls with double layers of lead and cork to prevent any echo or cry for help from escaping, making its iron doors impossible to breach from the inside. From abandoned hospitals, he procured an old iron chair, the type used for brainwashing and trauma therapy in old wars. Arthur modified the chair with precision, equipping it with steel cuffs to restrain all 4 limbs and strip the victim of any margin of movement. On the opposite wall, he arranged massive iron racks filled with a terrifying assortment of electrical cables, leather whips, branding irons, sharp surgical blades, and manual bone drills. He also designed a custom mechanical generator to produce high-frequency electrical shocks and mounted anatomical charts on the walls illustrating the locations of vital nerves in the human body to inflict the maximum degree of agony without causing immediate death. Yet, amid this terrifying arsenal of death tools, the most horrifying feature was Arthur's installation of reflective mirror panels covering the ceiling and walls entirely. He was not satisfied with torturing his victims for days on end. He found a sadistic ecstasy in forcing them to watch the details of their own torment and bodily decay reflected before their eyes at every moment. From the late 1960s until the autumn of 1999, secret evidence indicates that Arthur Vance Graham abducted and confined approximately 50 women and girls, all of whom were residents of the remote coastal villages of Cape Breton. The practices he inflicted upon them surpassed the human mind's capacity to endure, and it is believed that many victims perished from neurogenic shock and severe bleeding long before he intended to dispose of them. He confessed in his papers to unleashing starved rats onto their bound bodies and injecting them with concentrated doses of hallucinogenic and sedative fluids to compound their sense of disorientation and terror. When his passion for a victim ended, he would inject her with a chemical cocktail composed of 2 substances used in veterinary anesthesia to induce temporary damage to memory cells, erasing recent events completely. He would then transport them in the trunk of his car under the cover of darkness and discard their bodies in dense forests or rocky crags. Graham relied on 2 standard ploys to hunt his prey, either stalking girls at night stops to slip sleeping powder into their cups, or donning the official uniform of forest rangers and taking them away under the pretext of violating curfew regulations. This diabolical strategy succeeded for decades. Were it not for the vigilance of a single victim who possessed an iron while surpassing the rest, Arthur Graham would have remained free forever. That survivor was named Nadine Rira. In early September 1999, Arthur stalked Nadine around an abandoned gas station on the coastal highway. There is no ground to criticize Nadine or the difficult circumstances of her life at that time, but indications show that she responded to his conversation when he claimed he needed a cleaning lady for his office for a handsome wage. She raised no objection when he produced a forged badge of a health inspector and told her she had to accompany him immediately for an official investigation regarding the trafficking of prohibited materials. Arthur led her to the back seat of his truck, and the girl initially thought she was heading to the county's administrative building. One can only imagine the suffocating horror that gripped her heart when the truck veered onto the dirt road leading to the town of Iron Heart, specifically toward the abandoned lumber mill. By the time she attempted to resist, it was too late. He struck her with a cruel blow that knocked her unconscious, bound her with thick ropes, and dragged her into the fortified cellar, where he secured her to the iron shock chair. When Nadine regained consciousness in the gloom of the cell, she heard nothing but a mechanical, haunting voice emanating from an old tape recorder. That calm, cold voice belonged to Arthur Graham himself. The recording said in a monotonous tone, "Welcome to your new resting place. There is no use in trying to move your limbs. The steel chains are designed to hold the weight of trucks, and the haze clouding your eyes and your muffled voice are the natural results of the sedative. I realize you feel intense dread and fierce anger, and this is to be expected. But now you must listen carefully to every word from this device. I will explain to you the rules of your upcoming existence, what pain awaits you, and the duration you will spend under my guardianship. I do not know your personal identity." The voice continued broadcasting, because this tape was recorded in the winter of 1991 to serve as a general instructional guide for anyone whose foot treads into this place. "It is the product of my long experience in breaking rebellious spirits. You are here because fate chose you to be a submissive handmaid and a slave in this secret cell. These words may seem to you like the product of a sick imagination, but they're the only reality you will know from now on. It will require a monumental effort on your part to adapt to the whips of obedience, and your opinion on the matter does not concern me in the slightest. You will be treated as personal property until the time I decide to terminate your service. I select my prey with care, and you possess a strong body and a fresh youth that suits my designs." The female accomplice who helped Arthur manage this scheme and secure the prey was a woman named Marta Prescott, who was later sentenced to 30 years in prison for her criminal role in the obedience cell. Marta was responsible for luring vulnerable girls or runaways from their homes, whose disappearance would not arouse the interest of authorities or families. She also supervised the systematic starvation, though she did not possess that methodical sadistic mindset that characterized Graham. The recorded tape continued to inject terror into the captive's soul. "Your value here is no greater than that of the cattle in the neighboring barns," the voice added. "And like the rest of the farm animals, you will receive just enough water and foul food to keep you alive and maintain your strength. I receive 4 or 5 victims each year, depending on my personal desires and my need for novelty. My eyes never sleep. The prey might be a girl whose bicycle broke down in the forest thickets, or a woman practicing a morning jog on the isolated beach. Anytime an opportunity arises without security risk, I will bring her here, even if the chair is occupied by another. Variety dispels boredom. Although breaking you will be entertaining, I will eventually tire of your presence. Since I do not favor the idea of stockpiling corpses around the town, I have devised a safe way to exclude you after completely draining your strength. You will be injected with chemical compounds that strip away your mental capacity and temporal linking, and I will manipulate your memories for several consecutive days through forced hypnosis sessions. By the time of your departure, you will not remember the features of this cellar, nor my identity, nor the nature of the torment you tasted. The chains will leave no vital trace because your body will be cleansed with caustic substances. Afterward, I will return you to the outside world in ragged clothes on the side of a distant rural road, burdened with the pains of bruises that will heal in weeks, but your mind will be a mere blank page. You may not like the idea of erasing your mind, but it guarantees my survival, and it is certainly easier on you than ending up as a suffocated corpse beneath the soil. At the terrifying peak of the tape's verbal torrent, Arthur began delivering cold justifications about the impossibility of survival or rescue, saying, "Undoubtedly, there are investigations underway now and reports of her disappearance." Then he added cruelly, "But there is not a human being on Earth who knows of this cellar's existence beneath the mill. No police forces will come to rescue you, and no one will knock on this door. You are completely cut off from the world. As for the idea of escape, I know that human instinct will drive you to try, which is why I have installed a solid steel collar around your neck, connected to a heavy iron chain fixed to a ring welded into the concrete base of the floor. This collar is part of your body now and will not be removed until your departure. As I told you, you will receive your meals regularly, not for satiety, but to prevent your death. In the first few days, you will feel a severe weakness and a ravenous hunger, which is exactly what I prefer to break your will. The rules here are simple and few, but disobedience will be met with severe punishment. I do not like rebellion, and if forced, I possess enough surgical instruments to disfigure your body in ways you cannot conceive. If you try to bite me, I will rip out your jaw with iron pliers, and if you try to scratch me, I will tear your nails from their roots. These words may sound brutal, but they're the only guarantee of your total obedience. And if you cause me security troubles, I will not hesitate to slit your throat and throw you to the rats. As the tape neared its end, the tone shifted to a sickening calmness, urging the victim to surrender to ensure survival. As it said, "Be obedient, maintain absolute silence, and submit to reality to live. All the pain I will inflict upon your body will not leave a permanent disability if you do not resist. I am not deceiving you. Rather, I am placing before you the only map to survival. Deal with each day at a time. Be smart and swallow the pain in silence. Do not scream, do not speak without permission, and show the utmost submission and reverence for your master. I wish you a successful journey into my world." No human thought could fathom the depth of the psychological hell Nadine Rira suffered as she listened to those nightmare instructions. For 74 continuous hours, she was subjected to forms of physical torture and systematic psychological violation. On the third day of her captivity, Arthur was forced to travel to a neighboring town to deliver a shipment of timber, leaving Nadine under the sole guard of his partner, Marta Prescott. During the daylight hours, Marta left the room, heading upstairs to answer an urgent phone call, leaving the captive unsupervised for a few fleeting moments. Marta had become completely reassured by the state of exhaustion and surrender that Nadine displayed. But in that flashing second, Nadine noticed with sharp eyes that the guard had carelessly left the bundle of shackle keys on a nearby wooden table, almost within reach of her bound fingertips. She extended her body, her wound bleeding with all the strength that evaporated in her veins, and secured the keys with a silence in which she held her breath, beginning the trial of unlocking her wrist cuff. But in that critical second, the door flew open and Marta Prescott returned to the room, her eyes igniting with wild madness upon witnessing the escape attempt. A fierce and violent battle erupted between the two women in the depths of the death cellar. They punched and wrestled with nails and teeth, while the iron chains made a deafening din that shook the room's foundations. Marta managed to break free for a few seconds, grabbed a small, heavy oil heater that was placed in the corner, and slammed it down onto Nadine's head with all her might. Nadine reeled, blood pouring profusely down her face, inflicting a visual darkness and a fatal dizziness upon her. But the survival instinct drove her to extend her hand amid the chaos. As Marta lunged at her again to strangle her and finish her off, Nadine snatched a small handsaw left on the floor and plunged it with all her weight directly into the middle of Marta's neck. Marta collapsed onto the concrete floor, blood flowing heavily, blocking her airways as she let out her final death rattle. Nadine did not waste a fraction of a second. She unlocked the remaining restraints around her ankles, smashed the internal lock of the secret cell's gate, and rushed out into the bright light toward the highway, her nakedness covered by nothing but that heavy steel collar Arthur had locked around her neck. Within minutes, she reached a farm owned by an elderly man who took her in immediately, wrapped her body in blankets, alerted the authorities, and worked to calm her terror until medical and security reinforcements arrived. That was the end of the living hell she endured for 3 days. A hell that left emotional scars in her soul impossible to heal, but her legendary bravery wrote the final word for the reign of terror Graham had imposed for decades. Security forces moved immediately based on Nadine's precise statement, raiding the lumber mill, seizing the secret cellar, and taking Arthur Vance Graham and Marta Prescott into custody. During the extensive investigations, and when confronted with the evidence, shocking family truths came to light. It was revealed that Arthur had been documenting his victims' torture sessions with an old movie camera, keeping horrifying films in a secret safe. He had aimed to satisfy his sadistic whims in his old age, but those tapes turned into the conclusive evidence that shattered all his attempts at denial. Investigators managed to identify one of the girls who appeared on a tape dating back to 1996, and she turned out to be a woman named Beatrice Cole, identified thanks to a distinctive phoenix tattoo on her left shoulder. Beatrice revealed stunning and shocking details to the investigators. On the night she disappeared, she had engaged in a violent argument with her fiancé and left the house angry to meet some friends at the village pub. Among those present was a girl named Clara, and it happened that Clara was the biological daughter of Arthur Graham and his covert partner in his crimes. Clara later confessed that she had intentionally lured Beatrice to that remote pub frequented by her father. While the victim was in a state of distraction, Clara slipped a powerful sedative powder into her glass, which her father had provided to her in advance. When Beatrice stepped out onto the exterior sidewalk feeling severe dizziness and an urge to vomit, she received a treacherous club blow to the back of her head, losing consciousness completely. After days of abuse and torture inside the cellar, Arthur only released Beatrice because he mistakenly believed she had passed away due to the severity of the pain and electrical shocks. However, when he noticed that she was still drawing a faint breath while in the trunk of his car, he cut her throat mercilessly and discarded her body in a dry watercourse in the middle of the forest. How immense was his shock later when it reached his ears through town rumors that she had survived death by a miracle. But he was reassured by the fact that the case received no media echo. This was because no one among the town's residents or the police believed Beatrice's story at the time. Her fiancé immediately accused her of intentionally disappearing with another lover and breaking the engagement in a messy fashion, while the local investigator attributed the entire matter to mental delusions resulting from excessive drinking, completely failing to examine the evidence or track the perpetrator. The trial of Arthur Vance Graham lasted for long months and witnessed complex legal fluctuations. In the autumn of 2001, faced with a deluge of damning evidence and the shocking testimonies of the survivors, he agreed to sign a full confession in exchange for avoiding the death penalty, and was sentenced to life imprisonment for 180 years in a strict federal prison on charges of abducting and torturing 3 women, Nadine and Beatrice among them. On May 28, 2002, Arthur was transferred to the maximum security Atlantic Correctional Facility for a final interrogation by international investigators regarding his connection to dozens of mysterious disappearance cases that remained unsolved. However, death caught him by a sudden, acute heart attack minutes before the start of the first interrogation session, as he collapsed in front of the guards and never regained consciousness. As for his daughter, Clara Graham, she stood trial on charges of complicity in criminal abduction, and a sentence of 3.5 years in prison was issued against her, leaving the prison walls in the mid-2000s. Regarding Marta Prescott, who survived the saw wound after intensive medical treatment, she became eligible for parole in 2017 and was officially released to return to public life in 2019. This is the very same lady who did not hesitate to smash a heavy iron heater over an innocent girl's head simply because she tried to cling to her freedom, and she now practices her life in complete freedom, walking the very same streets inhabited by the family members of the victims whose lives she helped destroy and prey upon in cold blood. I grew up in a small, gloomy mountain town called Brackenberg, high up in Austria. For outsiders, the only thing they might know about us is the story of the old Gothic church that was destroyed in the last century. Its remains now sitting in the Museum of Religious History in Zurich, Switzerland. Beyond the town's borders, there are only misty, rugged trails and abandoned silver mines a few miles away. But apart from that, there is nothing here but dust, gravel, black pine trees, and scattered wooden cabins. I was raised by my mother alone after my father disappeared. And while words like discipline or rules didn't seem to exist in her daily vocabulary, there was one strict warning she repeated like a death sentence. Never go near the cabin of old Alistair Vance. Alistair lived in a secluded wooden shack on the northern edge of town, earning his living by collecting rare wild herbs, drying them, and selling them to pharmacists or turning them into medicinal extracts. He spent most of his time in the forest at night, But even when villagers spotted him, fear would silence them completely, knowing he was rumored to have made a man disappear once, and the authorities never dared to charge him. My mother told me he was an evil charlatan, and that the man he supposedly killed had been her older brother and her closest support in life. That was all she ever said, as if the memory was too painful to reopen. Over the years, I picked up fragments of rumors about Alistair's life and the strange rituals he was said to perform without consequence. I learned he had spent his youth on colonial expeditions into the jungles of Africa, volunteering for those dangerous journeys himself. But after returning, he was never the same again. He moved his cabin near the foggy Blind Lake, and elders warned young people not to go near the northern shore after sunset, because old Alistair would be there hunting foxes for his meals. "None of us want him mistaking you for a fox in the dark, do we?" the old man Hines would say with a sharp, serious look that left no room for doubt. But not everyone feared him. Some people almost pitied him. I remember when I was 14, I was walking with a friend when his mother was driving us somewhere in a wooden cart. The conversation turned to Alistair, and my friend spoke about him like he was a monster from stories. But his mother simply said sadly, "That poor man, all he wants is to be left alone." My friend protested, saying he had killed someone, but her expression suddenly changed, like a mask slipping into place, and she sharply warned him to stay away from the cabin. It felt like we had accidentally uncovered something hidden. I didn't understand what at the time. By the age of 17, Alistair had become, in my mind, the embodiment of evil itself. One night, my mother drank too much and finally told me the dark story of how her brother disappeared. She wasn't an alcoholic. She just had a few warm drinks on cold Friday nights while watching old shows. But that night, I came home to find her crying over old black and white photos of her youth, including her late brother. She said he had been out by the lake with friends when he stepped into the bushes and saw someone carrying a metal box with strange markings, with the faint sound of a child crying from inside it. He shouted at the man, who ran immediately. Her brother and his friends chased him through rough terrain until they cornered him at the rocks. The man dropped the box, turned, and fired a strange weapon. Bang, 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 killing her brother instantly. The child inside was later taken to the hospital, but died from a massive overdose of sedatives that destroyed her organs. Everyone who was there claimed Alistair was the shooter, yet he was never arrested or convicted. That was the moment everything clicked in my mind. I finally understood why everyone feared or hated him. As months passed, that hatred grew until I decided I had to act. I told my friends everything, and they knew how deeply I despised Alistair for what he had done to my mother's life. One night around a campfire, I suggested taking action. One of my friends had asked his father about the child who died from an overdose, and he confirmed the story, though with one difference. The child was found in town, not near the lake. That detail didn't matter to me. The story remained the same in my mind, and Alistair had to pay for what he had done. That night, I made my plan. I would go to his cabin after midnight, make sure he was asleep, and then burn it down. I now realize how foolish that was. I might have killed him, but at that age, I only imagined him running out in panic while his cabin burned, forced to leave and disappear. I stole a can of chemical solvent from school because I had no money. On a dark Friday night, after sitting by the campfire with my friends, I lied and said I was going home, but instead I headed toward Alistair's cabin. It took me an hour walking along the foggy lakeshore. When I got close, I turned off my flashlight and followed the water's edge until I saw a faint light from his cabin. I watched for nearly 40 minutes until the radio inside stopped and the light went out. After another minute of silence, I moved in. My heart was pounding as I approached the wooden walls. I thought I had gotten away unseen, but just as I was about to open the container of flammable liquid, I heard a sharp mechanical click to my right, the unmistakable sound of a hunting rifle. A voice came from the dark. "What are you holding there, boy?" I froze. It was Alistair. He told me to drop it. A beam of light landed on the can. Then he ordered me to turn around so he could see my face before killing me. But I couldn't move. I was shaking uncontrollably. He grabbed me, turned me around, and when he saw my face, he stepped back and lowered his gun. For a moment, he just stared at me. Then he suddenly said my name. I went from terrified to completely confused. He knew me. He even knew my mother. He said, "I wondered how long it would take you to come here." The first words I managed were, "How do you know me?" Instead of shooting me, he brought me inside his cabin and promised to tell me everything. Inside, surrounded by dried herbs and old books, he asked what my mother had told me about him. I told him everything, how I believed he had murdered my uncle and destroyed our family. He listened quietly, then said, "All right, kid, here is what really happened." He claimed my uncle had been deeply troubled since childhood and became increasingly unstable as he grew older. He was expelled for stealing from girls' changing rooms. He was later accused of inappropriate behavior toward younger students, though charges were reduced. And in the months before his death, he was seen behaving suspiciously around children. That night by the lake, Alistair said he was out hunting when he saw drunk teenagers moving through the bushes under the full moon. One of them was carrying an unconscious child. He followed them and realized they intended to harm her. When he confronted them, one of them tried to attack the child, so he shot him dead. He then rescued the girl, carried her to town, and left her at a gas station before reporting the incident himself. The police confirmed his account, and he was released. But he never forgave himself. After returning from Africa, he vowed never to harm a human being again. He lived in isolation because he couldn't bear the thought that the real criminals had escaped justice. He told me he didn't expect me to believe him, but asked me to return home and confront my mother with the truth. I did exactly that, and whatever happened in that final confrontation destroyed my relationship with her forever. I haven't returned to Austria in almost 20 years since that night. In the winter of 1993, my fiancé and I were driving through the foggy, winding bends stretching from the city of Portland to a small coastal town in Upper Maine called Whispering Pines, where his retired parents lived. Around noon, we had been cruising through dense, dark pine forests that hugged the highway for hours on end when, suddenly, the trees vanished in an abrupt blur. It was like emerging from a dark tunnel into a vast, naked expanse. But instead of seeing rocky shores or natural cliffs, all that stretched before our eyes was land entirely blanketed in black ash and the charred remains of timber. There had obviously been a massive fire that completely devoured the vegetation a short while ago. Although my fiancé tried to reassure me, explaining that local authorities sometimes resort to controlled burns to clear forests and protect them from pests, the scenery still sent a cold shiver down my spine. We were suddenly freed from the cage of trees that had blocked our view on either side of the road, and we could see the horizon extending for miles and miles around us. Thanks to this sudden clearing, it was incredibly easy for me to spot the silhouette of a large man holding the hand of a petite woman, walking at a slow pace amidst that scorched earth. I only caught sight of them from a distance at first, but the way they walked radiated a deceptive sense of tranquility and peace. At first glance, the scene looked like an old man taking his ailing wife out for a gentle stroll to breathe in the sea air across the open space. However, as I watched them with curiosity from the car window, I noticed that they were heading toward an old stone structure that resembled an abandoned family crypt in the middle of the town's ancient cemetery. I didn't say a single word to my fiancée. We were enjoying a comfortable, precious hiatus of silence while soft music drifted from the car's cassette player. So I simply kept watching this scene zoom in, becoming clearer as our speed carried us through an almost dead silence. By the time the duo reached the threshold of the stone crypt, I could see them in almost perfect detail. The old man wore a long, threadbare wool coat, and bald spots were visible on the crown of his head, which was covered in thinning gray hair. The woman wore a blue cotton dress and white canvas shoes, and the thick, undulating waves of her silver hair draped clearly over her shoulders. In the brief seconds we drove right past them, I saw it with an absolute clarity that left no room for doubt. The old man suddenly hoisted the petite woman into his arms, and with a violent heave, tossed her straight down into the dark, yawning opening of the unsealed stone crypt. I remember screaming, "Oh my God," at the top of my lungs the exact second after she fell. As my fiancée panicked, Gripping the wheel tightly and frantically asking what the hell was going on, I was hysterically tearing through my handbag looking for my mobile phone. I briefly thought about telling him to stop the car and get out, but a horrific, sudden image flashed through my mind. I envisioned our dead bodies lying in that black ash, riddled with gunshot wounds. So I just screamed at him to step on the gas and keep driving, blurted out that a man had just thrown a woman inside an abandoned crypt. He replied in sheer, utter bewilderment. What? What on earth are you talking about? He had been entirely focused on navigating the rugged road and hadn't glinted a thing. But once I explained the details with more crucial gravity and precision, he asked if I was 100% sure I wasn't mistaken, finally starting to grasp the source of the terror that had seized me. I eventually managed to find my phone, but when I unlocked the screen, I saw that the signal was completely dead, 0 bars. I instantly resorted to the alternative and pulled the paper map from the glove compartment to locate the nearest town. I felt a wave of relief when I found a small coastal settlement called Silver Haven just a few miles down the highway. I told my fiancé to put his foot down so we could reach it and dial emergency services. When we rolled into the town limits, the first place we hit along the roadside was a tiny diner and tavern called Julian's Kitchen. We veered sharply into the parking lot, and I nearly tripped and fell as I ran like a maniac from the car to the front doors. The moment I burst inside, the heads of every single patron spun toward me in shock as I rushed up to the wooden counter, begging the waitress to use their landline phone. The lady behind the counter calmly said, "Sure," and pushed the handset toward me. I immediately dialed 911 and asked to speak to the police. As I described what I had witnessed to the dispatcher, a heavy silence fell over the tavern. Everyone was eavesdropping, and I heard audible gasps of horror ripple through the room when I stated that I'd seen a woman get thrown into an abandoned crypt in the middle of the burned site. The dispatcher told me to wait right where I was so the sheriff could send a deputy over. I thanked her and hung up the cradle. The adrenaline was still coursing violently through my veins, controlling my body as I set the receiver down. When I turned around, every single person in that establishment was staring at me with frozen, stone-cold expressions. The lady behind the counter stepped forward and brought me a glass of ice water to help calm my nerves. While my fiancé and I waited for the police to show up, a man got up from his table in the corner and slowly approached us. He introduced himself, then began questioning us in a suspicious tone about the specific characteristics of the burned fields we had passed. When I recounted what I had seen, emphasizing how the blackened terrain stretched for miles, the man turned to one of the other diners and asked aloud if that land belonged to a man named Thomas Calder. That name seared itself into my memory with absolute precision. He then asked me to describe the old man I had spotted. Soon enough, everyone in the diner seemed to agree that the man was indeed Thomas Calder, and that his sick wife had been staying with him at his country estate that week because her doctor was out of state. A look of bewilderment washed over their faces, but it was laced with a strange wariness and a distinct, underlying suspicion. It was glaringly obvious that they knew this man very well. So hearing that he had committed something so monstrous seemed entirely beyond belief to them. They asked me several times if I was absolutely certain of what I saw. When I assured them that I had never been more certain of anything in my entire life, eerie whispers and low murmurs of unease began to echo through the room. I have no idea exactly how much time crawled by before a deputy actually showed up to speak with us. When he arrived, he requested that we step outside to our car so we could talk in detail away from the prying ears inside the diner. I repeated the whole sequence of events again, only to face the exact same skeptical reaction from the deputy, as if what I was reporting bordered on the impossible or a ridiculous piece of fiction. Right as he was grilling me with these interrogation-like questions, a second cruiser rolled into the lot. The county sheriff himself stepped out, having driven all the way from headquarters to talk to us. The deputy spared me from spinning my yarn for a fourth time by explaining precisely what I had reported seeing. The sheriff displayed the same cold, detached amusement, then walked a few paces away to murmur into his radio for a couple of minutes before returning to where we stood. The sheriff informed us that an officer at headquarters had called the Calder residence to ask him about my report. He stated that Thomas completely denied the allegation, claiming that although his wife was indeed home with him, neither of them had gone anywhere near that old cemetery or the burned grounds all day. At that point, I was practically begging the sheriff to get into his car and follow us down the highway so I could point out the exact location of the stone crypt. He replied with chilling indifference that he lacked the authority to trespass on private property and search a family crypt without an official warrant, and that he would have to interview Mr. Calder face-to-face before any such action could be taken. I tried to maintain my composure. I knew that the longer we wasted on this futile debate, the slimmer that woman's chances of survival became inside that pitch-black tomb, regardless of what lay at the bottom. If the crypt had deep underground vaults, she could suffocate or succumb to fractures. She needed to be pulled out immediately. I tried to convey all of these frantic fears with every ounce of energy I had left, but the more animated and insistent I became, the more the sheriff and his deputy stared at me as if I were suffering from a sudden psychotic episode of delusion and hysteria. I literally had to beg the sheriff until he finally, reluctantly ordered his deputy to drive out to the old crypt on that property to check things out. When the deputy finally drove off, a surge of genuine relief washed over me, nearly bringing me to tears. The entire time we waited, my fiancée kept patting my shoulder, soothingly saying, "It's going to be okay. You'll see. This crisis will end fine." The sheriff sat half-slouched in his car, muttering in a low tone over his radio. Suddenly, he bolted upright, walked over to us, and announced in a dry, clipped voice that he had good news. Firstly, the deputy reported that he found the crypt completely sealed and locked tight with its ancient padlocks, with absolutely no signs of forced entry. Secondly, Mr. Calder was currently on his way down to the diner with his wife, so I could see for myself that everything was fine and that the woman was alive and well. The shock knocked the wind out of me for a second, leaving me speechless because I was, and still am, absolutely certain of what my eyes witnessed out there amidst the ash. The sheriff took that window to explain, in a patronizing tone, how I had undoubtedly fallen victim to a visual misunderstanding. The two individuals I saw were probably just collecting artifacts or inspecting the building's foundations, and whatever scene of throwing or dropping I thought I saw was merely an optical illusion caused by the speed of our car and the smoke that was still thick in the air. The only question I managed to muster when words finally found their way back to me was, how can the deputy be so sure the crypt is empty? Did he actually unlock the doors and go inside to check? Did he inspect the dark catacombs beneath the floor with his flashlight? I knew what I saw. A human life was hanging in the balance, and I wasn't about to buy hollow reassurances, especially when they started tossing around phrases like optical illusion or trick of the light. The more they insisted on repeating those words, the more sinister and suspicious it sounded to my ears. I understood the small-town mentality of wanting to protect one of their own, but the cold, dismissive way they brushed off a potential murder began to cross the line from alarming to deeply disturbing. Just as I was trying to suppress my rage, fighting to keep my tone polite while explaining to the sheriff that I knew what I saw, the deputy's cruiser pulled back into the lot. But trailing right behind the deputy was a battered, ancient pickup truck. The moment it ground to a halt, a massive man stepped out, wearing a heavy wool coat, the bald patches on his head framed by thin gray hair. His very first words, delivered in a hostile, booming tone, were, "Now who's this saying I threw my damn wife inside a tomb of the dead?" The sheriff stepped toward him, trying to pacify him. "Easy now, Thomas, calm down. She's just a passerby trying to help." This man, named Thomas, marched around to the passenger side of his truck, yanked the door open, and roughly helped a woman step down from the seat. He then led her toward us with an aggressive, accusatory grip, barking that this was the wife I had allegedly thrown into a grave. My fiancée whispered in a low, placating murmur, "See? I told you everything would be fine." He sounded desperate to dissolve the volatile confrontation. But things were not fine at all. The woman I had watched through the car window amidst the ash possessed thick, undulating silver hair that cascaded clearly over her shoulders. The woman standing before us now had dark, extremely short, cropped curly hair. The panic seized my chest all over again, and I cried out in a hysterical tone, insisting to them that this was not the same woman I'd seen out there. The deputy tried to cut me off, claiming that the harsh sunlight reflecting off the smoke and ash must have made her dark hair look like a gleaming silver from a distance. Their systematic, relentless attempt to make me feel like I was insane or losing my mind made me want to scream at the top of my lungs. But I knew that breaking down would be the final nail in the coffin of my credibility. Instead, I forced myself to hold it together and asked if there were state investigators from outside the town I could speak to, as I felt zero confidence in their local procedures. While I was talking to the deputy, the sheriff signaled for my fiancé to step away for a private word. A few minutes later, my fiancé walked back, a bizarre paleness covering his face. He grabbed my arm with a firm grip and told me, in a tone that brooked no argument, that we needed to leave immediately. The sheriff had point-blank asked my fiancé if I suffered from mental illness or took heavy sedatives. When my fiancé nodded, just to protect me, the sheriff issued a stern, threatening warning to get me out of town right that second before I was arrested on charges of inciting a public disturbance and disrupting the peace. He made it clear that they would not tolerate outsiders rolling into their town, throwing around random accusations, and dragging the name of a prominent local citizen through the dirt. Therefore, unless we had official business to attend to, we were to leave immediately or face jail time. By that point, I was the one who desperately wanted to flee. A creeping, sickening dread slithered through my entire body. I could feel the suffocating weight of a dark network of evil ruling this small town, and I knew we would never unearth the bottom of this conspiracy while standing in the parking lot of that damn tavern. I offered a hollow, generic apology to that farmer and his alleged wife, whoever that poor, silent woman standing there actually was. The moment we crossed back onto the highway and my phone regained reception, I called the main state trooper barracks to report the entire incident. I told them that something deeply twisted and corrupt was happening inside that town, specifically on the property of a man named Thomas Calder. However, they got back to me days later with a dry, standardized report stating that they had dispatched an independent investigator and found absolutely no evidence of a crime or falsified identities. I tried to pursue the official complaints channel, asserting that my report was being handled with blatant negligence and that there was foul play involved, but the response came back unchanged. They had exhausted all legal avenues of inspection, and there was nothing further to investigate. But I know what my eyes saw. I have never suffered from any form of visual hallucination in my entire life. Not before that day, and never since. My vision is perfectly sharp, I do not require corrective lenses, and no, I'm not crazy. But I remain absolutely certain that the silver-haired woman is still resting somewhere beneath the black ash of that stone crypt. My father was a geological engineer who spent his youth exploring polar mines for international entities, and that was where he met my mother while working in the far reaches of the frozen Novaya Zemlya Islands in northern Russia. My mother's heritage and her polar culture were fundamental pillars of her life, so details like traditional northern dishes and the folklore music of the Sami culture were an integral part of my childhood and upbringing. We only visited those desolate parts once when I was a little kid. So, in my late 20s, I made the decision to pack my bags and fly over there to visit my remaining relatives and explore the land of my ancestors a wee bit. I was driving a rented SUV on a bleak, narrow dirt road in the middle of nowhere with no trace of life in sight, trying to find a small residential settlement where my relatives lived. Suddenly, I spotted violent red and white flashes reflecting in my rearview mirror. The security vehicles of the massive mining corporation that ruled the region were demanding that I pull over immediately for reasons unknown to me. Not wanting to cause any trouble in a country where I possessed absolutely no influence, I slammed on the brakes quickly and prepared myself to use my very rusty Russian, the bare basics of which I had picked up from my mother. But instead of the guards getting out of their vehicle and walking over slowly with dark shades unlike highway cops do in Western movies, and security officer wearing a bulletproof vest took an aggressive, defensive stance behind his open car door. He began shouting at me through a heavy iron megaphone, commanding me to stick my arms entirely out of the car window and secure them flat on the roof. At that exact moment, a pure, unadulterated terror began to gnaw at my insides. In my civilian life, I had never even glinted a real weapon up close, let alone found the muzzle of an automatic rifle aimed straight at my chest. While I was screaming at the top of my lungs at this guard, assuring him that I was unarmed and just a terrified tourist, he treated me as if I were a hardened cartel boss. He barked at me to shut my mouth completely as he slowly advanced toward the window, his eyes blazing with fury. He pressed the barrel of his rifle right against my face while trying to roughly cuff my right hand with one hand, to the point that any accidental twitch or unintended slip of his trigger finger would have been enough to splatter my brains across the passenger seat. To top off all this panic, additional corporate armored vehicles began pouring into the area, completely cornering my path, before they violently dragged me out from behind the steering wheel and threw my body into the back of an armored transport bound for their mining maintenance detention facility. The hours I spent inside that freezing, subterranean stone cell represented, without a shadow of a doubt, the darkest and most hollow point of my entire life. The interrogators kept hurling terrifying accusations in my face, using words like traitor, industrial spy, and saboteur of critical infrastructure. One of the guards even recoiled a step when he first saw me, gasping aloud, "It's him in the flesh, the fox who leaked the blueprints." I began to suffer from waking nightmares while fully conscious. I envisioned myself buried alive in a black site prison on the edge of the Arctic for a crime I had absolutely nothing to do with. To make matters worse, the guards took turns coming over to the iron wall of the cell just to shout insults and death threats at me through the bars. I kept desperately trying to tell them that I was a Canadian citizen and that I was only here on a short holiday to visit my family. But their responses were limited to dry, mocking sarcasm, saying, "Do you think we are fools enough to buy these lies? Shut your mouth before we shut it for you our way." It was brutal threats like that, back to back. This living hell went on for several continuous hours, and I felt deep down that my life was completely over and that I would never see the light of day again. Then, out of the blue, there was a sharp jangle of keys, and the heavy cell door swung open. The chief interrogator stood there, coldly informing me that there had been a mix-up in identity and that I was free to leave immediately. Stepping out of that secret detention facility was a surreal experience that defied belief. My entire body was shaking like a wet bird, while the security personnel acted with a bizarre mixture of laughing off the blunder or offering dry, hollow apologies on a scale that didn't cover a fraction of the psychological and physical torment I had endured behind those bars. They treated the situation as if they had mistakenly slapped a parking ticket on the wrong car, rather than dragging me at gunpoint into a dark dungeon. But despite the fury boiling in my veins, I was just desperate to get out of there and save my skin. I was terrified, yet simultaneously consumed by a raging anger. But I didn't dare show a single spark of resentment out of fear that they would find another excuse to throw me back into the dark. But right before I took my final step outside the building, the investigator turned his computer screen toward me and showed me a photograph of the man they had confused me with. He was a dangerous, internationally wanted spy corporate saboteur, a truly high-risk individual. And when I stared at his picture, a shockwave froze my limbs. It was like looking directly into a polished mirror. The features were completely identical, in a way that was utterly terrifying and skin-crawling. When I finally reached my relative's house and asked them bitterly if I was legally or financially entitled to any form of compensation from the mining corporation, they erupted into cynical laughter before replying, "No chance of that happening here." Even though the rest of my trip was spectacular, and I cannot deny the breathtaking beauty of the wilderness there, I haven't entertained the thought of setting foot on those polar islands since that day. And next time I decide to travel, I am forcing my relatives to bring their own cars to pick me up right from the threshold of that bloody airport. The cruelest, most ominous day of my career was a freezing Tuesday night, specifically in a remote mountain town called Clearwater, nestled high in the Oregon Highlands. Back in that era, in the winter of 1985, Clearwater was a tiny town of fewer than 2,000 residents, just a forgotten rural enclave surrounded by dense pine forests. We only had a small supply store, a gas station, an old wooden lodge, and a large municipal lumberyard. Aside from a few scattered cabins on the edge of the mountain, that was pretty much the entire town. The place was quiet, and everyone knew one another. Words like execution or massacre were never spoken in our local vocabulary. We only ever heard of such atrocities on radio broadcasts from major cities. But all of that turned to ash on that dark night, when real evil stepped off the television screens to walk on its own 2 feet through the streets of our peaceful town. It was nearing 10 p.m. on November 5th, and I was stationed at the Federal Border Patrol headquarters about 2 miles south of town, where the temporary detention center is also located. I was sitting quietly behind my wooden desk, sorting through routine permit files handed to me by another officer, when the sudden crackle of the radio shattered the silence of the room with an urgent distress call from dispatch. Since it was the quietest day of the week, none of us expected anything more than a passing domestic dispute or a minor car slide due to the ice. So when the radio signals began broadcasting the encrypted codes for an armed group and multiple casualties, I froze in disbelief for a few seconds, completely convinced there had been a routing error or frequency interference. But the moment I saw my fellow officers frantically rushing out toward the front door and leaping into the 4x4 SUVs, I knew the nightmare was real and left no room for error. I followed them into the parking lot immediately, gunning my car right behind theirs to form a fast-moving military convoy, piercing through the thick fog toward the abandoned train station on the north side of town. Known locally as the Old Station, it served as the meeting point for miners and the final commuters before the winter rail lines closed down. Moving through the pitch black was eating away at my nerves, especially knowing that the people working the guard and maintenance shifts out there were mostly folks from my town, perhaps even close friends of mine. When we reached the perimeter of the station, the external iron gates were completely locked, and we had next to no idea what lay waiting for us behind them. The 911 distress call that had reached dispatch came from an on-site technician who was bleeding out from the attack. Due to the agonizing pain and sheer panic, he couldn't put together many details. All he could utter in broken words was that there were bodies, masked gunmen, and survivors fighting for their lives who needed us immediately. The station featured wide glass windows that stretched all the way along the main platform. As we approached with our flashlights raised, we caught sight of a wide, horrifying trail of dried blood winding from the outdoor waiting platform and vanishing into one of the old iron cargo boxcars parked in the back. After breaking through the gates and breaching the interior, we discovered that the bloody trail belonged to a station maintenance worker. Despite being shot twice, he had dragged his wounded body all the way from the back of the yard to the landline phone room at the front to call for backup before slipping into unconsciousness. The other officers and I spread out immediately, clearing the platforms and corridors aisle by aisle with our weapons drawn to ensure no ambush was waiting for us in the dark. It wasn't until we reached the abandoned boxcar number 9 at the end of the track that we uncovered the rest of the tragedy. There were 5 more people inside. 3 of them were completely devoid of life, and a 4th was groaning faintly, suffering from deep stab wounds to the chest and neck. For some bizarre reason that defied logic, the attacker had left the 5th person, a night custodian, completely unharmed without a single scratch. There was nothing we could do to save the 3 victims who had been torn apart by gunfire, so we focused all our medical efforts on keeping the 2 surviving, dying casualties stable. Fortunately, we managed to keep them alive until the medevac helicopters arrived. While the paramedics prepped the wounded to be airlifted to the regional hospital, we listened to the full, harrowing account of the disaster from the mouth of the surviving custodian, who walked away from the slaughter covered in his colleague's blood, but physically untouched. The narrative was far more grotesque and tragic than anything we could have imagined. Every Tuesday night, a specialized maintenance crew took over to clean the internal tracks, inspect the boxcar brakes, and prep them for the following week. After the last passenger train departed at exactly 8 p.m., the station master would lock the main doors behind him, and the workers would begin moving heavy equipment and firing up the power washers. During that time, the lone remaining ticket clerk spotted a stranger in a dark jacket stepping slowly out from between the gray shipping crates. She initially assumed it was a stranded commuter who hadn't noticed the station closing, and she walked over to inform him that operations had ended and he needed to leave. Instead of answering, he raised an automatic rifle directly into her face, striking her dead with silence. The maintenance crew was working on the opposite side of the platform at that exact microsecond. The gunman moved with such quiet, absolute confidence that they didn't even notice their colleague's disappearance or the danger bearing down on them. The gunman forced the clerk at gunpoint into the back administrative office while the workers remained completely oblivious to what was unfolding behind the walls. Once inside the office, he forced the station master to open the iron safe and hand over all the available cash and weekly ticket sales. His strike was perfectly timed, hitting right at the end of a heavy shipping season. He managed to seize a few $1,000s in cash, along with travelers' checks and money orders totaling $3,000. But instead of fleeing after getting his hands on the money, the gunman marched the station master and the clerk back out onto the cargo platform, rounding up the maintenance and cleaning crew under the weight of his weapon. I didn't personally see the restraints he used initially, but investigations later revealed he had grabbed heavy plastic zip ties stolen from the station's own shipping warehouse. He drove all 6 of them into the hollow belly of abandoned Boxcar number 9 and ordered them at gunpoint to bind one another securely. He tied the last person up himself. Our survivor told us that once everyone was bound, they genuinely believed the ordeal was drawing to a close. The man had his money. He had everyone tied up to ensure they couldn't call the law right away, and he had absolutely no rational reason to do what he did next. Yet he went ahead and did it in cold blood. This is where the events took a deeply sadistic and subhuman turn. The gunman ordered the victims to lie down on the cold iron floor of the boxcar in pairs, forcing them to stack on top of one another like cords of firewood. Before anyone could decipher the horrific purpose behind this arrangement, he muttered in a low, audible tone, "May God forgive me for what I am about to do," and opened fire directly into the human stacks. He only managed to get a few shots off before his rifle suffered a mechanical jam or ran entirely out of ammunition. As he fled into the dark, the survivor believed for a second time that death had missed him and the nightmare was over. But seconds later, the butcher came running back, wielding a sharp hunting knife he had snatched from the maintenance tools. He stepped up to the survivor, asking in a dry, flat voice, "Are you going to tell the cops what I look like if you get out of here?" Naturally, the survivor cried out in terror, "No, I swear to you." The young man stacked on top of him, who he later learned was his own younger brother working on the same crew, did the same. But as the brothers desperately tried to convince him they wouldn't breathe a word to law enforcement, the killer snapped. He went into a frenzied, hysterical rage, stabbing the older brother on top with vicious, unchecked force. He dragged the blade across his throat from ear to ear, slicing his windpipe, and kept plunging the knife into his back until the metal blade snapped off inside the victim's body. The survivor claimed the killer, then turned to him a second time, asking with the exact same chilling calm if he would identify him to investigators given the chance. When the survivor repeated his denials and pleas, the gunman spun around with the bag of money and calmly walked out of the boxcar, leaving the last man alive in a pool of blood. Our survivor said he remained paralyzed in place out of pure dread, certain the maniac would return just as he did when he went to grab the knife. To make matters worse, his brother's lifeless body lay pinned on top of him with all its crushing weight and blood, making any attempt to move or wriggle free an impossible feat, even if he wanted to. After an agonizing stretch of silence, the other maintenance worker at the front of the boxcar, whom the killer assumed was dead from the initial gunfire, managed to painfully free his wrists from the plastic ties. He began a long, agonizing crawl toward the front platform, which was where we ultimately uncovered him, the landline receiver still clutched in his trembling hand. When the sweeping federal investigation took over in the following days, I don't remember ever being so emotionally invested or consumed by a case in my entire military career. One of the victims slaughtered in cold blood was a direct relative of the county's border patrol chief, turning the manhunt into a personal, vengeful mission to hunt the bastard down and bring him to justice. But right from a first step, the investigation began stumbling into flawed and complicated paths. First, it turned out that the train station's security camera and monitoring system was completely offline and out of service at the time of the attack. A repair technician had been scheduled to visit the station and fix the glitch the very next week. The timing of that malfunction haunted my thoughts and kept me awake for years because it stripped us of any footage or image of the suspect's face. Second, although all three survivors provided us with an identical and highly distinct description of a man, stating he had a crooked, deformed nose and strange hazel eyes, the composite sketches we circulated through newspapers and precincts yielded absolutely no sightings or leads. No solid ones, at any rate. All we got was a passing report of a white sedan with Maryland plates speeding away from the edges of town via Mountain Highway 17. Even then, the timing didn't perfectly align with the moment of the massacre. By the time authorities tracked down and intercepted the vehicle later on, its owner was completely cleared of any involvement. He was just a traveler in the wrong place at the wrong time. Perhaps the most frustrating and sickening part of the case was how the core federal team became utterly obsessed and fixated on a single, fleeting detail that I'm still not sure was even true. At one point, while they were held inside the boxcar, one of the victims cried out through her tears, "Why are you doing this to us?" While she was referring to the degrading, barbaric way they were being stacked on top of one another like cattle, the psychopath apparently thought she was asking a deeper, existential question about his motives for the robbery. He replied with a cryptic phrase, claiming he was a former police officer who had been wrongfully terminated from the force. Even though early forensic checks proved there was zero match for his fingerprints in the national law enforcement databases, the lead investigators remained entirely convinced that the perpetrator's tactical execution pointed to a background in the military or law enforcement. This assumption completely contradicted what I and some of the local officers believed. We saw him as nothing more than a seasoned fugitive and international runner who slaughtered because he wanted no witnesses left behind to trace him. But by the time the federal team began treating our hypothesis seriously and shifted the direction of the manhunt, the killer could have easily slipped across international borders using the thousands of dollars and financial documents he plundered from a safe. That remains my best guess as to why he was never caught to this day. After the dust settled on the catastrophe, my colleagues in law enforcement spoke of what happened at the station as if it were a road tornado or a sudden act of God. They framed it as a random, tragic anomaly that no human could have predicted or prevented. But those words did nothing to wash away my absolute sense of helplessness and guilt. The most horrific crime in Clearwater's history since its founding 2 centuries ago had unfolded while I sat in total comfort behind my desk, filling out routine paperwork, while some sick bastard was stacking human beings and blowing their brains out 2 at a time at that very microsecond. But the greatest riddle that my mind still fails to untangle or comprehend to this day is, why did he deliberately let the last victim live? Our wounded survivor confirmed that the killer looked him dead in the eye and said textually, "I'm going to let you live to witness." That single phrase makes my fugitive theory about erasing witnesses look incredibly shaky and contradictory. Part of me tries to convince myself that he simply grew exhausted, his hands tiring of the slaughter, and he couldn't face the emotional or physical strain of plunging a blade into a second human being after believing he had already snuffed out 4 other lives inside. Yet, there's another part of me, a dark, quiet voice that whispers in the back of my mind, that believes the butcher intentionally left a lone survivor behind so he could tell the world exactly what happened in the dark. He wanted everyone to know what his hands had done and the terrifying precision of his execution, so he could later relish reading the gruesome details of his own craftsmanship in the pages of regional newspapers, sipping coffee somewhere out there in the world. I try to purge that final thought from my imagination whenever it creeps in, because when I dwell on it, the agonizing pain of failing to catch him and secure justice becomes an unbearable rot in my soul for the rest of my days. I spent the early years of my youth in the locked northern sector, a semi-abandoned industrial territory located in the furthest frozen expanses of the Federal Republic of Vanland. It was the year 2114, a time when this sector was ruled by the First Engineers, a radical, extremist faction that completely rejected the use of modern digital technology or wireless networks, relying entirely on ancient steam mechanics and heavy manual machinery. They referred to anyone belonging to the outer cities as an outsider, and that was my upbringing. We lived like alien outcasts on our own planet. But I knew no other life, so I was entirely content with my reality, until the dawn of November 2nd of that cursed year. Like most boys in that harsh society, I left basic education early to help my father in the family's massive steam turbine maintenance workshop. On that bitterly freezing morning, we were working together to dismantle a heavy iron engine, while my younger brother was over at the vocational training facility on the opposite side of the courtyard. Everything was proceeding according to our usual routine. Just another day amidst the deafening roar of machinery, when my father suddenly turned, looked toward the hazy horizon, and said in a suspicious tone, "Isn't that your little brother?" I raised my eyes and scanned through the thick fog, only to glimpse a tiny shadow running frantically between the railroad tracks toward our workshop. I knew instantly it was him. My father muttered in suppressed anger, "What the hell is he doing out of the training hall at this hour?" as the clock pointed to exactly 11 a.m. I followed my father as he bolted with wide strides toward the reception hall to find out what was happening. When we stepped inside, we found my brother drowned in tears, with my mother desperately trying to soothe his panic. My father initially assumed the boy had simply fled from his instructor to escape some punishment, so he was preparing to lecture him harshly. But when my brother finally managed to catch his breath and utter the words that had caused his flight, I felt as though the hands of the clock had frozen entirely, and the blood ran cold in my veins. He told us that a bizarre, deformed entity had breached the training hall, and that it carried a sharp hydraulic weapon. Yet, that wasn't even the most terrifying revelation, for as my father, trembling with rage, rushed toward his locker to pull out his heavy rifle, my brother added in a shaking voice that the creature was also hauling massive iron chains and jagged biological hooks. Panic consumed my father. He rushed like a madman out of the workshop toward the old training building, shouting back at me to stay exactly where I was and watch over my mother and brother. We were forced to wait for hours on end before my father returned, carrying the gruesome details of the tragedy that had unfolded inside. When he sat down with us, this is the full story of what he recounted. Around 10:30 that morning, shortly after the trainees had returned from their recess in the courtyard, a heavy iron cargo transport vehicle parked directly in front of the building's main entrance. A massive figure clad in a dark, leathery shroud stepped out, breached the interior, and coldly asked the female instructor if she had found a missing pressure valve in the outer corridor. A mechanical valve is an ordinary piece of iron hardware used to fasten and secure steam pipes, a common tool in the industrial sector, so practically everyone at the facility knew its shape and purpose. Since the instructor hadn't spotted anything of the sort that morning, she politely apologized for not being able to help, wishing him luck in finding his missing hardware. The individual's demeanor was profoundly unsettling. He refused to hold eye contact and merely muttered incoherent phrases before turning around to head back to his vehicle. But a single minute later, he barged back into the hall, this time wielding a pneumatic, bolt-throwing weapon, shouting at everyone to submit to his commands or have their bodies ripped apart. Assuming it was a straightforward raid for fuel reserves or spare parts, the instructor ordered the trainees to remain calm and comply with his demands. But instead of plundering the workshop, safe, and fleeing, the man ordered all the boys present, including my brother, to help him unload items from his transport and carry them inside the classroom. They hauled in a collection of sharp tools, a portable flamethrower, and a high-voltage electrical stunner, alongside massive stacks of thick timber, wiring, chains, and what we later learned were heavy iron eye hooks used for suspending flesh. This entity wanted to force the children to witness the biological ritual he intended to inflict upon them. However, while the intruder was occupied supervising the unloading from his truck, The instructor seized a moment of distraction, bolted for the exit, and successfully reached the outer gate guardian to blast a critical distress signal to the federal security forces. Realizing the instructor had slipped through his fingers, the captor ordered one of the boys to go out and drag her back, then immediately set about barricading the building's doors using the timber and heavy nails the boys had brought inside. Once he finished sealing off the exits, he allowed 3 individuals to leave, including a pregnant maintenance worker, along with all the male trainees in the hall. Immediately after, he forced all the remaining girls and female apprentices to line up in a straight row facing the solid metal wall, as if preparing to execute them all by himself. The first federal security vehicles arrived at the perimeter just minutes after the automated distress signal was flagged. Using his external loudspeaker, the commanding officer pleaded with the armed entity to drop his weapons and allow the trainees to exit safely. At the exact same time, the intruder patched a call through to the operations command room, explicitly threatening the dispatcher that if any force advanced a single inch toward the barricade, he would execute the hostages instantly. He was barking these ultimatums right in front of the terrified girls, ensuring they knew exactly what was about to happen. Hysterical, they began weeping and begging him not to hurt them. 2 of the girls even pleaded to be shot first, likely hoping that sacrificing themselves might buy the other children time or spare their lives. But the man ordered them to be quiet and kept negotiating with the forces outside. My father said that by 11 a.m., a massive crowd of miners and engineers had gathered tightly around the security cordons, with emergency medical transports lining up to evacuate the wounded. Then suddenly, the sound of gunfire erupted from within. My father described the sound that rose from the surrounding crowd as something no human ear should ever hear, a collective, agonizing wail of mourning. For every echoing blast meant the extinguishing of an innocent young life and the shattering of families whose hearts would never fully heal. As the shots continued to pop off, the security forces rushed the barricaded doors to breach the building and halt the slaughter. But the intruder anticipated their breach and began firing heavy iron bolts at the officers from high upper window. The forces returned heavy fire, taking care to target only the specific window from which they were being pinned down. Suddenly, the gunfire from inside ceased. The officers assumed he had either been hit or was reloading his weapon. But when they finally shattered the reinforced door and stormed the main hall, they found him lying dead on the floor from a single, self-inflicted projectile wound to his own head. It was later revealed that just seconds before opening fire, he had tried to call his residential unit to say goodbye to his partner. It seemed she hadn't answered, but he left a recorded voicemail message. When she arrived home later, the first thing that caught her eye was a set of handwritten journals on the table detailing the bloody layout he planned to execute that day. She had called emergency services immediately in a desperate bid to stop him, but her warning came entirely too late. Her partner was already minutes away from murdering innocent children. The wounded girls were rushed to the military hospital under heavy escort. Of the 10 children struck that morning, only 4 survived. A few were pronounced dead at the scene, and I learned that one little girl passed away right in the arms of a federal officer as he desperately tried to comfort her and wipe the blood from her face. The victims were all between the tender ages of 6 and 13. For some incomprehensible reason, in the middle of the massacre, the intruder decided to stop using his pneumatic bolt thrower and switch to using the portable flamethrower to incinerate the rest, even though he still possessed ample ammunition for his first weapon. Many forensic investigators believe he switched weapons deliberately to inflict maximum disfigurement and create severe biological devastation, making the scene even more grotesque than it already was. No one could comprehend the motive behind such behavior. Death is absolute, but deliberately making the scene as mutilated and horrific as possible seemed like a brand of pure evil that defies human understanding. But after the investigation laid bare his identity, and more importantly, his underlying motive, the sick puzzle began to fit together. Discovering the identity of the perpetrator sent a violent shockwave through the entire locked northern sector, because almost everyone knew the man. His name was Marcus Vane, and he lived in the lower residential complex. He worked as the driver for the fluid and fuel transport rigs that visited local workshops and farms on a rigid schedule, sometimes multiple times a week. He actually knew the families of some of the children he slaughtered, and he had a partner and 2 kids of his own at the time of his attack. The investigators interviewed his coworkers, who stated that despite his long history of psychological and behavioral disorders, he seemed bizarrely cheerful and elevated in the days leading up to the massacre. This sudden euphoria was undoubtedly born from his decision to execute the harvest and construct the biological incubator, which had granted him a twisted sense of absolute power and control. The security agencies also believed he drew inspiration from a similar hostage crisis that had hit the vital Colorado sector during that very same week. Of course, there was no way to get definitive answers from him since he was dead, but he laid out the precise drives that pushed him to commit this atrocity in the journals and the voicemail recording he left behind. It turned out that Marcus suffered from severe genetic mutations and biological hallucinations that drove him to harm children. Records showed he had abused 2 of his female relatives when he was just 12 years old, and he confessed to his partner that he was experiencing vivid waking fantasies of doing it again. This explained the specialized synthetic gels and biofluids recovered by forensic units at the scene, meant to build a grotesque biological hatchery. Marcus also claimed in his journals that the death of his daughter 10 years prior during childbirth was the catalyst for his destructive desires. He wrote that he was filled with venomous hatred toward himself and the Creator due to her loss. Although his 2 female relatives completely denied the historical abuse allegations, investigators concluded that their denial was simply driven by a desire to maintain privacy and escape social stigma. The community ultimately concluded that Marcus was nothing short of a psychotic monster, as he never physically touched the girls inside the hall, choosing instead to execute them in cold blood before taking the coward's way out. Throughout the week that followed the tragedy, federal bulldozers completely demolished the old training facility, leveling it to the ground so it could no longer stand as a physical monument to that horror. While the stoic grace of the first engineers community filled me with a sense of pride in many ways, it simultaneously marked the beginning of my realization that I did not belong among them, and that I could not stay. For instance, one of the very first things the elders of the faction did was approach Marcus's father, who was entirely shattered and devastated by what his son's hands had wrought. They told him face to face that they forgave his son for his actions. In fact, a massive crowd of locals even attended Marcus's burial as a profound show of solidarity for his broken family. Initially, I thought this stance was noble. It certainly wasn't the parents' fault that their son had mutated into a sick monster. But the specific detail that my mind flatly refused to accept, and which filled my soul with revulsion, was their choice to extend that total absolution and forgiveness to the butcher himself. These engineers were conditioned never to harbor grudges or malice under any circumstances, but I simply could not find it in the depths of my being to forgive a parasite who brought biological containment fluids into a hall full of innocent young girls just to liquidate them and snuff out their lives. There was a pervasive cultural philosophy promoting the idea that the capacity to forgive makes you a spiritually superior, elevated human being. When it came to the concept of prevention and securing the outpost against future horrors, their common refrain was simply, "The matter rests in the hands of the Creator now. The Almighty alone is responsible for shielding us." I distinctly remember another worker telling me he felt relieved that Marcus Vane had taken his own life, because it meant he stood before divine judgment at the exact microsecond we were laying those poor girls to rest, and that if he repented a fraction before death, his sins would be washed away. The more I dwelled on this philosophy, the greater my sense of isolation grew, and I realized with absolute certainty that I possessed no home within this radical ideological framework. Now, nearly 10 full years have passed since I packed my belongings and left the locked northern sector behind me, never once looking back. Thank you, my friends, for listening and following along. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you can be alerted to all future novels and stories. I grew up in a small mountain town nestled high in the Swedish north called Kiruna, a place where everyone knew one another. The welcome sign at the entrance of the town stated that the population did not exceed 1,500 residents, but that number felt much smaller when you actually lived there. The town was built around an old mine, with a rugged rural road cutting right through its center. There was a single grocery store, a gas station with a small corner selling hot fast food, a hardware store that also supplied skiing and hunting gear, and a single school building housing all grade levels, separated by long hallways and metal lockers painted in faded colors. The air always carried the scent of pine mixed with heating fuel during the summer, and the smell of burning firewood and damp earth in the winter. I remember November of 1994 with brutal clarity, a clarity that makes thinking about it painful even today. That was the winter before everything in our town degraded, before people changed and houses locked their doors. Back then, life had a slow, gentle rhythm. Trucks passed through the town, but not too often, and the snow fell in a quiet, peaceful silence. The nights felt incredibly long, but safe, and most residents left their front doors unlocked. The greatest dangers we feared were sudden black ice on the roads, or reindeer leaping out in front of cars in the pitch darkness. There was a boy in town named Oliver Nielsen. That wasn't a pseudonym. It was the kind of name that echoed constantly in local cafes, church halls, and daily school attendance rolls. Oliver was 14 years old, but looking at him, you would never believe his age given his extremely frail physique. He stood barely 1.25 meters tall and weighed no more than 30 kilograms. Even in his heaviest winter clothes. He bought his jackets from the children's section because adult sizes hung off him like a vast tent. He walked quickly with short, rapid strides, like a toddler trying to keep up with an elder. His face looked much younger than his years, rounded cheeks and soft features. But his eyes, my God, they told a completely different story. They were sharp yet exhausted all at once, as if he were scanning everything while looking at nothing in particular. Oliver had Asperger's syndrome. Most of the townspeople didn't know the difference between it and classic autism. All they knew was that his mind worked a bit differently from other children. Honestly, we all loved him for it. He was completely genuine. If he was happy, his joy radiated clearly. If he was confused, he said so without hesitation. And if a room became too loud or the lights too bright, he would quietly withdraw outside, pressing his palms against his ears, closing his eyes, and breathing deeply, as if trying to keep his small world from collapsing. At school, everyone treated him like a younger brother, not out of pity, but because even the teachers knew his home life was an unbearable hell without anyone having to voice the bitter truths out loud. We would see blue bruises on his arms, always dismissed as accidental trips, clothes reeking of stale smoke and mildew, and a profound hunger evident in the way he sneaked near the lunch line early every day. His mother, Elena Nielsen, was the kind of woman who smiled with an excessive, fake sweetness in public, but would explode like a taut wire behind closed doors. Her husband spent most of his time drinking, surrendered to a perpetual stupor. As for his older sister, she fled the house and left town the moment she turned 18, never looking back. Oliver would get himself into trouble on purpose sometimes, mostly small things, pulling the school fire alarm, spray painting the town hall fences, overturning trash cans at 3 in the morning, or climbing the old water tower, just to panic people. It felt as though he was begging anyone at all, to care enough to stop him, to draw a line for him, to truly see him and understand his suffering. But no one was harsh with him. Not the local police chief, nor the principal, nor the neighbors. We had all tacitly and silently agreed to treat him with gentleness because we knew he never received any of it home. He was genuinely cherished, the kind of child to whom neighbors brought extra hot soup on brutal winter days, gave rides to, waved at in the street, and slipped candy into his pockets without him even asking. His favorite color was a bright neon fluorescent green, not a calm, grassy shade, but that glaring green of highlighter pens. His backpack was bright green, his pencil case was green, and even his shoelaces. He once told the art teacher that this green felt like warmth rather than just a color the eye could see, and we all just nodded because that was Oliver. He said things that made no sense at first until you reflected on them and realized they struck the absolute core of the truth. During the final school week before the Christmas holidays, winter struck the town with unusual severity. Snow accumulated to towering heights around the houses, and sharp icicles dangled from rooftops like pointed daggers for much longer than usual. The river froze completely in sections that had never frozen in previous years. Some homes still relied on wood stoves for heat, so the smoke rising from the chimneys twisted into slow, gray spirals all day long. The cold felt heavy, like a breath trapped in our chests. Oliver arrived at school sick that Monday. It was clear he was suffering deeply, as his nose ran constantly, his small lips looked slightly blue, and his tiny hands shook without stopping. He wore 2 woolen sweaters under a very thin coat that was utterly unfit for such polar weather. Every step he took seemed like a grueling effort beyond his strength. Yet his mother had insisted on sending him to school. Worse still, she had locked the front door after he left, leaving him homeless should he return early. By Tuesday morning, Oliver had completely vanished. His bright green backpack was found inside his school locker. It was open and half-packed, as if he fully intended to return shortly. His asthma inhaler was there, his math book, and his green pencil case with its edges chewed raw from pure anxiety. But there was no sign of Oliver. The school administration called his mother repeatedly, but there was no answer. The police chief drove to the Nielsen home and knocked forcefully on the door, but no one answered. We all initially assumed he had run away. Teenage runaways in November were not rare, and small towns always hoped these runaways would end up somewhere warm and safe, perhaps with relatives in another city. But Oliver was a creature of meticulously organized routine, and he was not the type to flee or disappear without a carefully mapped-out plan. Weeks dragged into weeks, and the ice would melt slightly only to freeze over again with even greater hostility. Everyone spoke of him in whispers and muted tones, as if speaking aloud would make things worse. Posts on local social media pages said things like, "Missing, but likely somewhere safe. Send your warm prayers. Check your sheds and barns just in case." People clung to hope like a lifeline in a deluge. Then January of 1995 arrived, and Oliver had been gone from sight for nearly 6 full weeks. The school organized voluntary search parties. These weren't orders from the police, but rather feelings of love and responsibility moving the hearts of the townspeople. Men searched abandoned logging trails, women inspected distant summer cabins, and teenagers poked around old barns and garages. The faded green posters bearing his face began to erode and dissolve under the weight of rain and snow. No one openly accused his mother, Elena, but everyone began to notice the strange, suspicious silence surrounding her. The silence of a mother who never panicked, never begged for help, and was never seen trembling with fear at the police station demanding updates. On a freezing afternoon in mid-January, someone finally uncovered the horrific truth. That man was Kurt Hallberg, who was checking empty rental properties to ensure they hadn't suffered damage from the frost and winter. One of these houses had sat vacant for over a year. Dusty windows, a backyard buried under mounds of dead leaves, and a stone chimney that hadn't felt fire since the last tenants departed. Kurt climbed the ladder to the roof to check if wild birds had built nests in the vents, and it was there that he inhaled an incredibly foul odor. It wasn't the usual smell of dead animals, rotting wood, or old insulation. It was a deeper, heavy, and nauseatingly pungent stench. Realizing something was terribly wrong, he called the police immediately. The police sent a large team to the site. There were no fire trucks or blaring sirens, for everyone in town felt at that exact moment that something had broken forever on this day. Oliver had attempted to enter the vacant house through the rooftop stone chimney opening. The most maddening and tragic part of it was that he was incredibly close to succeeding due to his tiny size. The top opening was wide enough, but old chimneys are built in a way that narrows progressively as they go down. They are not straight walls. They are funnels and lethal traps for small bodies that lack a plan for escape. Oliver had slipped inside, thinking warmth awaited him at the bottom, thinking an empty space meant safety from the harshness of the street, and thinking that climbing down was easier than facing doors barred in his face. Perhaps he wasn't thinking of anything at all except that hiding inside, whatever the cost, was far better than freezing in the polar cold outside. Despite his small size, he was still too large for that narrow brick funnel. Oliver got stuck in the middle, his shoulders and small ribs wedged halfway down. No one heard him screaming and begging because the thick brick swallowed the sound entirely, and the winter wind was howling outside louder than any cry for help. No footsteps passed near that abandoned house that day, and it never crossed the mind of any adult to look inside a chimney. Not to look for a child, at least. It took long weeks before death claimed him. The cold and sealed chimneys does not kill quickly in the absence of smoke or fire. There was no smoke, only brutal, icy nights, a slow freeze draining life drop by drop, and rough brick walls embracing him harshly, tightening around him every time he tried to shift his body to adjust his position. There was nothing but sickness, silence, and absolute isolation. I find myself constantly thinking of his small lungs burning with freezing air instead of smoke, of his cheek resting against the frozen brick, and of his frail body slowly surrendering to death, while neighbors slept peacefully just a few meters away from him. The tragedies of small towns do not scream aloud. They freeze in absolute silence, inch by inch. The aftermath that followed the discovery was harsher on us than the initial shock. It wasn't about the gruesomeness of the scene, but the terrifying reality that this beacon of purity and innocence had turned into a lifeless corpse. The town fractured into successive stages of grief and ached like silent dominoes. Shock, followed by absolute silence, followed by denial that quickly mutated into a raging anger. A raging anger that found no place or person to vent itself upon. The school closed its doors and suspended classes for a full day, followed by an entire week of psychological support sessions for the students. On the following Friday, everyone wore bright fluorescent green, neon green gloves, green shirts, and green woolen beanies. Some men and fathers looked eccentric, wearing glowing green hunting vests with their massive wooden clogs and snow-stained jeans. But no one cared about appearances at that moment. The town's community center distributed small green ribbons fastened with metal pins, the tiny kind that pricks your finger if you don't handle it carefully. The exact same kind of pins Oliver used to hang his drawings on the school corkboard during every art exhibition. The church bells tolled forcefully and for longer intervals that winter, not to instill hope, but to remind us of our guilt and failure, of that mother who didn't answer her phone for a whole day when her child vanished, who waited a month and a half before anyone truly knew what happened to him, and who kept insisting that he was probably fine and elsewhere, and that he wasn't worth all this fuss and disruption, until the fuss finally found him as a cold corpse. We ended the year 1995 feeling completely numb. The town sign remained exactly the same, pointing to 1,500 residents, but a vibrant, glowing green spot had completely vanished, dissolving into the brickwork. No one allowed themselves to forget what happened. They still speak of him to this day, many years later, not as a ghost story to stir dread, but as a lesson driving them to offer extra care and attention to every strange, small, and silent child walking alone in the winter nights. The Nielsen family departed from the town by February of that year. They said goodbye to no one, nor did they share their new address with anyone. They faced no public legal punishment, but they received a condemnation and scorn from the community that was far heavier than any judicial sentence. That house remained abandoned for much longer than usual, and the chimney was sealed shut and tightly reinforced with iron sheets and sturdy steel bolts, not to prevent ghosts from escaping, but to sever any false hope or repetition of that tragedy. Some disasters do not fade, nor does time erase them. Instead, they grow sharper and clearer, ringing like an alarm bell. Yet lessons never heal wounds. They merely interpret them and explain their causes. The town still aches today. Some businesses closed, many residents left, and the streets have become louder and more crowded with strangers. 1,500 is a number the town never reached again, and we began to date events and measure time based on two eras: life before Oliver and life after Oliver. And the subsequent era was not easier or kinder. It was simply a heavier burden to bear. The ending is as clear as day, and it is not just a passing line, but a naked truth. Oliver did not run away from town, nor was he hiding out of a desire to be distant. Oliver took a wretched, wrong path because the doors closed and bar-in-your-face force you to make foolish and fatal choices. Oliver died an agonizingly slow death in the freezing cold of that lethal brick because the person who was supposed to give him love and safety abandoned him, leaving him with nothing but bad, dark entryways, and bad, dark entryways in this life are often bad, lethal exits as well. This is the story. This is the scar carved into our hearts, and this is the bitter truth. Small towns never heal from the death of a fluorescent child who departed in absolute silence. They only learn how to carry the weight of this guilt together, even if the outside world never becomes any better afterward. I grew up in a remote coastal town nestled in the British county of Cornwall called Port Haven, a place where everyone knew the exact hum of the vintage street lamps and memorized the fractures in the stone pavements by heart. It was one of those towns where you could name every single family living in your entire block. Summer there always smelled of fried apple pies, hot asphalt, and the engine oil wafting from the annual fairground machinery that arrived on massive flatbed trucks in the middle of every July. It was a place where the occurrence of anything evil seemed utterly impossible, until the day that proved otherwise. When I was a child, the residents were still speaking of the missing boy, even though the incident had taken place many years before my birth. His name was printed on old, faded posters stapled to the wooden poles in the center of town. By the time I turned 8, the paper had yellowed completely, its edges curling and stained by rainwater, to the point that the small square reserved for his school photograph was barely visible. He was 8 years old, too, when he vanished. The exact same age I was when I last noticed the remnants of those tattered posters. The festival was the biggest event of the year, held right in the heart of town. Our town center was small indeed. A single main road cut straight through it, and everything else branched off like arteries. The festival would completely fill the parking lots, block off the small side streets, and swallow the town's public square, transforming ordinary days into roaring nights illuminated by colored bulbs, its grounds turning sticky from spilled sodas. It lasted for 3 days from Friday to Sunday, concluding with a spectacular fireworks display over the old grain silos just outside the town limits. 30 years ago, on the second night of the festival, the little boy vanished without a trace. People say it happened between 7:30 and 8 p.m., just as the sun had almost entirely dipped below the horizon, though the sky still held onto its last deep navy glow before turning into pitch blackness. The boy was holding a bright green balloon shaped like a small dragon. You can still find old festival photos and family albums where children stand posing with that exact same dragon balloon. Vendors sold them every year as a tradition that never stopped, even after the story became a deep, unhealed wound in the body of the town. The town's police force at the time consisted of a local warden, 2 deputies, and a woman working the front desk to answer radio dispatches. There were no advanced surveillance cameras, no facial recognition technologies, and no digital registries. The corners around the spinning rides and the Ferris wheel were dark in that era, and the shadows hung thick behind the food stalls. This made vanishing amidst crowds that otherwise felt entirely safe terrifyingly easy. Witnesses later said they saw a man near the boy just before his disappearance. He wasn't a stranger. Rather, he was their neighbor who lived in the red brick house adjacent to theirs, a property distinguished by a small gravel driveway and a back porch that groaned sharply in the winter cold. The suspect's father and the missing boy's father were close friends. They shared work tools, evening chats, and hunting trips in nearby woods, the kind of friendship built on borrowing lawnmowers and sincere, small-town handshakes. The little boy used to constantly run into his yard because everyone trusted him blindly. When they arrested him, he confessed immediately. There was no mystery to the trial, no sudden plot twist, just a cold confession that shook the town to its foundations. The details were so profoundly hideous that adults to this day refuse to utter them aloud, describing it simply as the worst thing that ever happened here. That single confession altered every summer that followed. Parents began holding their children's wrists with a tighter, fiercer grip, and the taste of fried pies and sugary drinks took on a sudden bitterness in the throat. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison. For most towns, this would have been the end of the narrative. The case would be closed in the archives with a sigh of relief, buried beneath the dust of time like anything else that fades away. But not here. The laws during that period were different, and the legal loopholes were wider than logic. After serving only 8 years, the man secured a parole release. There was no relocation to another city, no protective exclusion zones, and no mandatory distances enforced. He returned to walk the streets of the town, wearing a gray hooded sweatshirt and worn-out, scuffed shoes. He moved right back into the same red brick house with his elderly parents. The exact same porch, the same garden, and the same wooden fence he once leaned against to make small talk with the victim's father. The elders claim that his return was like watching a black storm cloud roll back into the sky, just as the earth had begun to forget the shape of rain. The house next door was still occupied by the missing boy's family. They had never left. Some say it was grief that froze the family's steps, while others claim it was a silent, simmering hostility determined to see justice done. When he returned, the patch of grass separating the two homes looked like an invisible border, sharp, jagged, and screaming with silence. No one spoke to him. The streets became cold and deserted the moment he passed through them, as though an unplanned curfew had suddenly been imposed. He was supposed to report to the parole office to prove his attendance every single morning. The office was an old, brown brick building situated near the railroad tracks, which still stands today with its windows permanently half-shrouded by blinds and a recycling bin outside that reeks of damp cardboard after the rain. I have passed by that office thousands of times, and every single time I do, the details flood back into my mind. About a week after his return, the man stopped showing up. He did not arrive at the office that morning. On that day, the police radios crackled back to life. The voices tight with a surprise that didn't actually feel like a surprise. It felt as though destiny was simply rearranging itself back into its proper course. His parents filed a missing person report before noon. The report itself has become a matter of public record now, whispered about in gatherings more than it is read. They described him in it as any frightened parents would: his height, weight, the color of his hoodie, and the last time he was seen. It was a bizarre attempt to simulate normalcy after a tragedy the size of the festival. I was 13 years old when I first heard the rumor of what had happened to him. Rumor is a polite word to describe something that everyone believes implicitly without anyone confirming it out loud. They say that the friends of the missing boy's father were the ones who took care of it. It wasn't shadows or ghosts, nor was it the police or the law, just fathers and uncles who had carried grief for longer than they had ever carried a weapon, and whose bonds of loyalty were sharper than any penal code. They say it happened at night. No screams were heard. No tires left skid marks on the tarmac. None of the town's domestic animals fell into a sudden panic, and there were no late-night phone calls. Just a man who vanished as though he had been completely erased from a photograph. When you walk down his street now, you see the red brick house, but it looks abandoned even though it isn't. The windows are clean but entirely devoid of life. The fence is painted every spring, but the wood derives no joy from the fresh coat. The neighbors mow their lawns, but his front yard remains wild. Not chaotic, but untouched, like land left to heal itself without any human interference. The festival continued to run every year. They never stopped it. Fried food, cheap prizes, and stuffed whales dangling from cords. The exact same massive bolts on the Ferris wheel were tightened and secured by the exact same workers who knew nothing of the old confessions. Children still carry balloons, but no longer the ones shaped like dragons. The green dragon balloon quietly vanished from the vendors' merchandise lists many years ago, without any formal announcement. without any objection, just a slow, gradual removal that everyone collectively agreed upon without ever needing to speak a word. Life in the town moved forward, but in a different manner, safer, quieter, and much heavier. By the time I turned 18, the old men who had been friends with the boy's father had aged considerably, but they still walked through the town center with backs straight enough to carry heavy secrets. Their boots were always dusty, even after the rain, and their coats reeked of metal and wood smoke. When curious teenagers or visiting hikers ask about the man who returned on parole and then suddenly disintegrated into thin air, these old men do not spin dramatic tales. They do not boast. Their tongues do not slip with details. The rhythm of their breathing never alters, and they do not shift uncomfortably in their seats or weave intricate lies. They merely look at you with absolute, unyielding certainty and say a few words, like telling you they know he won't be coming back and that they are sure of it. That certainty feels carved rather than spoken, like a headstone with no name written upon it. As I grew older, I studied psychology for a time, and I learned that human beings confess to crimes driven by guilt, fear, or coercion. But I also learned that silence can sometimes be infinitely more powerful than any confession, for silence tells you the entire story without ever risking the price of words. Do I truly know what happened to him? No. No one possesses proof. There are no files, no witness statements, and no truth signed on paper. But in this town, belief does not require evidence. Belief grows in the empty spaces between the street lamps, in the dead distance separating the two neighboring houses, and in the unspoken tension of winter nights that smell of fence paint and old wood. And since the story did not end with the sentencing, nor with the parole, nor with the disappearance, the true ending became the town itself. The ending became the warning, the adaptation, and the collective exhale that lasted for decades. The man never returned, not after his absence from the parole office, and not after the rumors solidified into a fixed certainty. The case technically remains open on paper somewhere deep in the police logs, but it is completely closed in the minds of the inhabitants of every house, shop, school corridor, and festival ticket booth. The conclusion is this: the man is gone forever, the town remains standing, the family kept their home, and the festival kept its colored lights. Justice here does not wear an official badge. It wears the quiet voice of people who have lived long enough for their weight to outweigh the monster. And if you try to press them for more, they content themselves with a smile holding that same deep-rooted truth. He won't return, and we are sure of it. That is the end of the story, clear and stretching out like the line of street lamps that leads out of town, where the horizon absorbs the noise and the silence finally gets the last word. A severe fever struck me before the expedition could even properly begin. The repercussions of a long flight from Chicago to Iceland had exhausted my body in ways I hadn't anticipated. My throat burned as if someone had run a piece of coarse sandpaper over it, and my chest let out a muffled rattle with every breath. By the time the plane touched down, I was coughing into my jacket sleeve every few minutes, trying by all means not to look as sick as I felt inside. The air in the capital, Reykjavik, was thick with sea moisture and dense fog. But that part of the journey was behind us now. We were now inside the 4x4, moving east across the rugged roads and mountain passes of the East Fjords Peninsula, in places where the sky appeared so vast and monolithic that the earth beneath it seemed minuscule and forgotten. I had always been captivated by remote, tiny fishing villages, the ones with wooden signs at their entrances that looked hand-painted by trembling fingers, the local shops that had kept the same battered wooden benches for decades, and the filling stations that still hung an old brass bell above their doors. We used to call them whale villages as a sort of inside joke among us. The western counties had granted us vast expanses of sweeping, dry grass, while the central highlands caught us off guard with sudden blizzards and herds of wild reindeer running parallel to the highway. The northern forests offered the scent of pure pine, which made the burden of my cold feel a little less sharp and painful. But the moment we approached the borders of the SVK district, the atmosphere shifted entirely. The land stretched out silent, barren, and completely devoid of any signs of life. Dilapidated fences ran for miles with absolutely nothing behind them, and old fish-drying shacks leaned on their sides like ancient, weary animals broken by exhaustion. The radio stations began to vanish one by one from the display screen, until the speakers gave up entirely and released a static hiss. By the time we drew close to the outskirts of the Grindavik municipality, the sun looked equally tired and defeated. The clock read 5 p.m. at the onset of twilight, and the lighting was dim, golden, and deceptively normal. We were in desperate need of fuel and a place to spend the night. Our usual plan was simple and well-rehearsed. Find any cheap inn or campsite, pay a few kroner, grab a quick hot meal, and then sleep to wake up early. A predictable, safe, and comfortable routine. The town we found was the kind of place you might miss if you blinked just once. A single, narrow main road with a population sign indicating a tiny number. Maybe 120 residents or 95. The number didn't matter. It was minuscule enough to be swallowed by the desolate wilderness surrounding it. There was a single gas station, a small pub, a small square hotel with a sloped roof sagging in the middle, and a few scattered old buildings that looked as though they were waiting for a strong gust of wind to knock them down. Nothing else. No one walking the alleys, no stray dogs, no parked local trucks, and no car headlights moving on the side streets. Only the still hum of nature filled the voids. The twilight insects were waking up, the rustle of dry grass danced with the wind, and the distant metallic ticking echoed from the slowly cooling engines of cars we could not yet see. Our vehicle veered toward the gas station, and the crunch of gravel beneath the tires mingled with the remnants of the old, cracked asphalt. The fuel pumps were ancient, painted red in some bygone era of history, but weathering had turned them into a pale, chalky pink. The station building was a rectangle of yellowed concrete blocks, with a twisted, bent metal antenna rising from its roof like the stem of a withered flower. There was a small garage attached to the building, its wooden door dented and partially open, revealing a dark interior filled with engine maintenance tools hanging on the walls like the ribs of a dead animal's ribcage. The beverage cooler buzzed continuously behind the window pane, while the neon open sign flashed with a lazy, erratic rhythm. While I was filling the car's tank, the rest of the crew walked in slow circles, stretching their legs and rubbing their faces to shake off the sleep and fatigue of the long journey. No one spoke. The town made talking seem futile, as if it rejected any kind of noise. My throat was still burning like fire, so I preferred to keep my mouth shut anyway. I felt dry dust particles clinging to my windpipe every time I tried to stifle a cough. I remember that moment like a still photograph that suddenly began to move. There was a small window on the side of the station store, partially obscured by a drooping curtain that was opened just enough to reveal the inside corner of a room I assumed was a canned goods storeroom. The place was dark, stacked with boxes, and looked somewhat damp. Then a movement occurred. Just a fleeting glimpse. A human silhouette smaller than adult size darted toward the far corner. A shaven head and extremely pale skin that caught a sliver of the fading daylight. The frame resembled a child's body, but it was contorted in a way I couldn't explain at the time. The shoulders were eerily still, and the posture was hunched, as if hiding were an ingrained habit rather than a temporary reflex. The moment my eyes locked with it, the head jerked upward rapidly. The figure retreated backward, plunging into the pitch darkness with a swiftness that left no room for doubt or the pretense that I was hallucinating. It saw me, and it knew I had caught a glimpse of its presence. This knowledge made the surrounding silence feel not like an ordinary void, but like a bated, expectant breath. I didn't enter the store after that, and neither did any of my companions. We all silently agreed that buying snacks could wait. My friends seemed to stare at the surrounding buildings as if discovering their existence for the first time, even though they had been crouching there all along. The horizon was slowly dropping around the town like a trap quietly closing. It reminded me of movie scenes where the camera focuses long and hard on a dusty silence before a violent event unfolds. But this wasn't a cinema screen, and that precisely is what made it more terrifying. Real towns shouldn't look like a staged, prearranged set. We got back into the car, the doors shutting behind us with a heavy thud, and the tires rolled past the first 2 blocks until we found ourselves entering the parking lot of the only diner in this area, a place called Hans Inn. The diner's exterior sign was made of metal, a faded blue color, bearing letters that had been white in the past, but the harsh climate had turned them the shade of ancient bones. The restaurant was low and sprawling, a slender structure with a cracked front doorstep and windows fogged at the edges by accumulated grease and time. There were only 2 cars in the lot, 2 old sedans, the kind that looked so clean it prevented you from saying they were broken down, yet too old to be modern. They weren't luxury cars, but they were preserved and maintained in a strange way that aroused suspicion compared to the decay surrounding them. From the outside, the diner appeared vibrant with life. Overlapping loud voices, the clatter of knives on plates, and the creaking of wooden chairs. The sound suggested warmth, like any small-town pit stop where locals wind down their day. My stomach churned because something in this scene did not align at all with the dead street behind us. But hunger pushes logic aside. We needed food before heading toward the glacial mountains the next day. The crew formed a spontaneous line behind me as we advanced toward the door. The sound cut off completely the exact instant we stepped inside. It didn't fade gradually. It snapped as if someone had pressed the mute button for the entire town. Every head turned toward us in the same frozen microsecond. The diner was crowded in a way the exterior could never have predicted. Long tables filled every corner. Heavy boots scuffed the floor, and dark winter jackets hung on wall hooks. Weather-beaten faces, young and old, all carried the exact same expression, flat, cold, and assessing features, as if they were measuring something invisible surrounding our bodies. Cups were raised halfway to mouths, spoons were frozen in midair, and dozens of conversations were severed in the exact same shared second, as if the entire room were a single organism reacting to the entry of a foreign body. At first, I thought they might just be curious. Travelers rarely pass through here, but ordinary glances of curiosity move, blink, and turn away after a moment. These stares, however, remained fixed, their eyes glassy and unblinking. Their bodies leaned forward slightly, but not out of welcome, rather out of anticipation. It was the kind of look people give when they know something you don't. When a mistake steps through the door, and they're trying to assess whether they should correct it or let it run its course to the very end. In the booth directly opposite the door sat an old woman. Her back was permanently stooped, that bend acquired after decades of hard labor and continuous bending. Her hair was thin and white as snow, and she wore a faded gray cotton dress, something between church attire and the clothes worn to feed livestock at dawn. She didn't move at first, then her head turned with a speed far slower than her age should have allowed. Her movement was incredibly dragging and deliberate, as if designed to draw attention and to make the air grow heavy and tight around that moment. 2 black patches of cloth rested over her face, covering both of her eyes entirely, secured by a single elastic band wrapping around her head. I couldn't see her eyes, but I could feel their piercing intensity from beneath the patches, like holes being drilled into my flesh. Her voice was low, but it carried a harsh rasp like gravel scraping inside a tin can. Ancient vocal cords that had spent far too much time in the dust. The question she posed fell unbalanced into this absolute silence. What are you looking for here? The question wasn't about food or orders. It was about our right to exist inside this space. The concept was clear and absolute without the need for further explanatory words. I heard nothing after that except the roar of survival instinct within me. My body turned toward the exit before logic had enough time to formulate a single sentence. My friend's boots skidded behind me, and not one of them waited to interpret the tone or the words. We were already running with all the strength we possessed. The outer door burst open violently, and the cold evening air hit our faces like a pure antidote for the lungs. We scrambled back into the car, hands shaking, keys clattering against each other to unlock the doors faster than life had moved inside that diner. The engine roared to life, and the tires shrieked, leaving erratic tracks over the gravel. We didn't slow down at intersections because the town barely contained any. We pointed the car toward the ring road surrounding the peninsula, just as migratory animals head toward water sources. As we sped away, that little town began to shrink in the rearview mirror until it looked like any other insignificant speck of civilization. Just buildings, just signs, and just the end of a bad, terrifying pit stop. My cold returned to assert itself with brutal reality, roaring in my body after fear and adrenaline had briefly pushed it aside. My throat was still burning, but that burning was definitive proof of life. I was alive enough to choke on the air, and alive enough to escape a place etched so sharply in memory to be innocent or harmless. We didn't stop driving until the nature of the surrounding trees changed, and until the roads began to look like they belonged to open, natural lands, not a dark trap guarding a locked secret. Hour after hour, the highway pulled us north and west, away from that isolated spot in Iceland, until the daylight surrendered entirely to the darkness of night, and the stars no longer seemed like witnesses to our ordeal, but returned to being just stars again. Eventually, we crossed the border into the towering mountainous regions. The air became crisper, the trees grew taller, and the mountains gathered on the horizon like good, slow guardians instead of that lurking, oppressive silence. For days on end afterward, the most frightening shapes we saw were wild bears moving through the distant forests and thick clouds dragging their heavy shadows over the volcanic rocks. Nothing supernatural, nothing prearranged, just nature practicing its nature, wild but clear, dangerous but fair and just. That moment in SVK stayed with us long after the county borders ended. We talked about how a town this small could contain such a massive number of people inside a single diner, unless that place was the only beating social heart for several miles around. We guessed that it might be a town where strangers were viewed as a genuine threat. Perhaps they had faced trouble with previous visitors in the past, and maybe that collective stare was a defensive mechanism rather than an intention to cause harm. We also tried to find a rational explanation for the old woman, thinking she might have worn both patches for medical reasons or due to an old injury that had claimed her sight. But all those rationalizations were unable to erase the deep psychological impact of that moment. For humans can be far more terrifying than ghosts because they are real and because fear doesn't need visible claws to perform its lethal function. The journey continued without any similar incidents after that. We traveled through valleys and under clear, gentle skies, and we camped under the weight of a heavier, cold smelling of pine resin and dewy earth, not engine exhaust. We drove until the mountains swallowed the horizon in ways that made the heart soar with joy and comfort, rather than shrink in terror. And when we finally reached the depths of the Icelandic highlands, the peace we felt seemed well-deserved. Not a false peace like the movies, and not the suspended, suspicious silence of the diner, but a real peace, the kind that tells you the danger has now transformed into just a story to be told, rather than a threat we live in the present. Years later, I still remember that in the buzz of a neon sign, the precise silence imposed at the exact right moment, and the coordinated collective stare. But the memory stops and ends at the highway, where we manage to outrun the confusion and escape with our lives. And that part is the most important of all, for the ending here is not an ongoing mystery, but survival, continuous forward motion, the vast distances we covered, and lungs that still function and breathe even through sickness, and a long, winding road that brought us back to the ordinary, natural wilderness, where strange occurrences remain mere passing moments and never grow to turn into something worse and more bloody. My name is Teodor, and I am writing to you from Romania, specifically from a region that most people outside of Eastern Europe have never heard of and would struggle to locate on a map without a great deal of squinting. I understand this completely. If you asked me right now to point to the state of Wyoming with any confidence, I would hand you back the map and apologize. And I remain personally unconvinced that a place called Tallahassee exists outside of someone's imagination. Geography is humbling for all of us regardless of which direction you're pointing. So let me tell you where I come from and why it matters for what I'm about to describe. Romania sits in the part of Europe that the rest of Europe tends to forget about until something goes wrong there. Wedged between Ukraine to the north, Bulgaria to the south, Hungary to the west, and the Black Sea pressing against our eastern edge like it has somewhere else to be. We are a stubborn and deeply superstitious people who have survived centuries of occupation by developing a talent for endurance and an even greater talent for dark humor. If you tell a Romanian that things could be worse, they will look at you with an expression that says they already know exactly how much worse things can get and have drawn up a detailed list. We are not pessimists. We are people who have been paying close attention. The region I come from is called Maramureș, a mountainous area in the far north of the country that borders Ukraine and that has always existed somewhat independently from the rest of Romania in terms of its customs, its rhythms, and its relationship with what people politely call the old ways. Deep in this region, accessible by a single road that the county government has been promising to resurface since approximately the early 1970s, there's a small town built around a valley that locals call Vârful Negru, Black Peak, named after the dark granite ridge that towers over the eastern end of the settlement and casts a particular quality of shadow over the lower streets in the late afternoon. The town has perhaps 800 residents, a market that operates on Thursdays, 2 churches of different denominations that have not spoken to each other since an incident involving a boundary wall in 1962, a timber mill that employed most of the working population through the communist period, and a salt mine that has been operational in various forms since the medieval period and that provides the other major source of employment. I grew up there. I left at 22 and have not gone back to live there since, though I visit my grandmother twice a year and she makes sure I eat enough to sustain a man twice my size before she lets me leave. I tell you this so you understand that I am not a tourist describing a place I visited once. I am from there. I know the specific way the fog comes down from the ridge in October. I know which families have feuded with which other families across 3 generations. I know the particular silence of the valley on a Sunday morning. And I know what happened during 10 days in March of 1987, which is the reason I am writing to you now. To understand what happened, you need to understand something about Vârful Negru during the communist period, which in Romania ran from 1947 until the Revolution of December 1989. Romania under Nicolae Ceausescu was not the same as Romania under a more relaxed communist government. Ceausescu was a different category of ruler entirely. He was building his vision of a new Romanian society with the enthusiasm of a man who had never once been told that his ideas were bad, and the consequences of this for ordinary people were severe in ways that accumulated over years into something genuinely crushing. The Securitate, the secret police, had informants in every workplace, every apartment building, every social gathering of more than 3 people. Rationing meant that basic food items were available only in limited quantities regardless of what the state-run shops claimed to stock. Heating was rationed. Electricity was rationed. Women were legally required to produce a minimum number of children to contribute to the state's demographic ambitions, and access to contraception was controlled accordingly. Saying the wrong thing to the wrong person in the wrong context could mean a conversation with a Securitate that you might not fully recover from. In Vârful Negru, specifically, the tension between different groups within the town had been building for years before 1987, and it was building around a specific source of conflict: the salt mine. During the communist period, the mine had been nationalized and expanded significantly, and the expansion required the demolition of a section of the older part of town, a neighborhood of traditional wooden houses that dated back several centuries and that held a particular significance for the older residents. The families displaced by the demolition were rehoused in concrete apartment blocks on the western side of the valley that were functional and entirely without character, and the resentment this generated was profound and lasting. The mine workers who had been brought in from outside the region to manage the expanded operation were predominantly from southern Romania and were, in the perception of many longtime residents, receiving preferential treatment in terms of housing allocation, ration book categories, and access to the better supplied shops. Whether this perception was entirely accurate is something historians can argue about. What matters for the purposes of what I'm telling you is that it was widely and sincerely believed, and belief is what drives behavior. Layered beneath this contemporary grievance was something older. Maramure's has a tradition of folk belief that has persisted through every political system that has tried to discourage it. And in Varfel Negru, the particular local tradition centered on what are called the Dome de Piatra, the Ladies of Stone. These are not benevolent figures. They're described in the oldest accounts as women who had been wronged by the community and who had retreated into the mountain, from which they periodically emerged to settle scores that the living world had declined to settle on their behalf. There are specific rituals described in oral tradition for appeasing them. Offerings left at the base of the ridge on certain nights, particular behaviors to avoid in the weeks surrounding the spring equinox, prohibitions around working the salt after dark. Under communism, these practices were officially classified as superstitious remnants of a feudal religious culture and were actively discouraged. The younger generation largely abandoned them. The older generation performed them quietly and without advertising the fact. And in the years leading up to 1987, with the demolitions completed and the outside workers installed and the resentment at a steady simmer, certain older residents began to say privately that the town had stopped maintaining its obligations and that this would eventually be noticed. I do not believe in the Dome de Piatra. I want to be clear about this. I'm a trained civil engineer, and I believe in physical explanations for physical events. But I also grew up in a place where the line between what is believed and what is real is considerably more porous than in other places I've lived, and I have come to understand that a community's belief in something is itself a real and consequential force regardless of whether the thing believed in actually exists. The first event happened on a Tuesday evening in early March of 1987, during a period when the temperature in the valley had dropped far enough to freeze the smaller streams, and when the roads in and out of town were passable but unreliable. A man named Grigor Antal, who worked as a shift supervisor at the salt mine and who had lived in Varfel Negru his entire life, walked into the community hall where a mandatory political education meeting was being held, the kind of meeting that everyone attended because not attending was worse than attending, and produced a hunting rifle that he had carried in under his coat. He fired it 3 times into the ceiling, which sent approximately 60 people diving for the floor and behind the furniture. And then he stood in the center of the room and delivered a speech of approximately 4 minutes in which he described in specific and articulate detail exactly what he thought of the regional party secretary, the mine's appointed director, the demolition of the old neighborhood, and the allocation of priority ration books to the incoming workers. He named names. He cited specific incidents. He was precise and organized and had clearly been composing this speech for some time. Then he put the rifle on the floor, sat down in one of the chairs as though he had finished a business presentation and was waiting for questions, and waited for the Securitate officers to arrive. They came within 20 minutes. He was taken away without resistance. The room he left behind was entirely silent for an extended period before anyone moved or spoke. What Grigor Antal had done was not an act of violence. The shots had been fired at the ceiling specifically to ensure no one was harmed. But what he had done was in some respects considerably more dangerous than violence. He had said out loud, in a public place with witnesses, exactly what people had been thinking privately for years. He had named the names. He had described the grievances. And the Securitate, faced with 60 witnesses to a speech that could not be denied or reclassified as a private matter, was going to have to respond in a way that everyone in town would see. Grigor Antal was not seen again in Varfel Negru for many years. What happened to him in the interim is something I was told about only much later and do not have space to address fully here. The town absorbed this event in its characteristically contained way. People went back to their lives. They did not discuss it in places where discussing it was inadvisable. They noted it privately and filed it and waited. The waiting is important. Varfel Negru had a particular collective capacity for absorbing shocks and then waiting to see what came next, a capacity developed over centuries of being a small settlement in a region that larger powers periodically decided to do things to. You learn to wait. You learn to reserve your response. The problem was that the next thing came before the waiting was finished. 5 days after the community hall incident, on a Sunday afternoon when most of the town was either at home or making the cautious social visits that are the primary form of winter entertainment. A woman named Elena Duma was found in the river that runs along the northern edge of the valley. She was alive, which was in the circumstances remarkable, having been in the water long enough to develop serious hypothermia. She was recovered by two men who had been crossing the bridge above the point where she was found and could offer no coherent account of how she had come to be in the water or how long she had been there. The river at that point was shallow enough that she had not been swept away, but the temperature of the water was low enough that another 30 minutes would almost certainly have resolved the question of her survival in the other direction. Elena Duma was 53 years old, in good health for her age, and lived with her husband in one of the older houses that had survived the demolition by virtue of being on the wrong side of the marked boundary. She was not known as someone who took risks. She was known as someone who made excellent preserves and had strong opinions about the correct way to prepare certain traditional dishes, and who had served for 12 years as a reliable and somewhat feared member of the local school's parent association. She was, by every available measure, not the kind of person who ended up in rivers. She had no memory of anything after waking up that morning and starting her usual Sunday preparations. Her husband said she had left the house at approximately noon, saying she was going to visit a neighbor. The neighbor confirmed that Elena had arrived, stayed for approximately 40 minutes, and left in entirely normal spirits. The river was not on any route between the neighbor's house and the Duma home. There were no witnesses to whatever had happened in the interval between Elena leaving her neighbor's house and the two men finding her on the riverbed. She recovered physically. Whether she recovered in other ways is a question her family answers differently depending on who you ask. What the community registered was this. Within a week, a man had been taken by the Securitate and a woman had nearly drowned under circumstances no one could explain. Two things. Two shocks. Absorbed. Filed. Waited upon. The third thing was the one that broke the waiting. It was a Saturday, 9 days after the community hall incident and 4 days after Elena Duma's recovery. The town's population was going about a Saturday in the manner that the available conditions permitted. Reduced rations, cold houses, the careful management of relationships under surveillance. When late in the afternoon a family in the eastern part of town, closest to the base of the ridge, failed to answer their door when a neighbor came to return a borrowed implement. The neighbor, a practical woman not given to excessive concern, went to the window and looked in and saw enough to make her leave immediately and bring back 2 other people before she would go inside. The family consisted of a father, a mother, and 2 children. The children were 12 and 9. What the neighbor had seen through the window was the father, who was alive, sitting in the kitchen with a quality of stillness that was not the stillness of someone sitting quietly. By the time people went inside, it was clear that the mother was not alive, and it was equally clear that the father was not going to be useful in explaining what had happened. He was not injured. He was not, as far as anyone could determine, in a state that any available medical framework could describe cleanly. He was present in the room and absent from himself simultaneously. He responded to his name being spoken. He did not respond to any question put to him. He sat in the kitchen chair and looked at the wall for 3 days before the medical services from the near city arrived to take him somewhere with better resources than Varfel Negra's clinic could offer. The children were not in the house. They were found the following morning, having spent the night in the root cellar beneath the woodshed at the back of the property. They were cold and frightened and could say very little about what had happened beyond the fact that there had been sounds and that they had run. Neither child was harmed physically. What they carried away from that night in the way of lasting damage is not something I have detailed information about, and I would not share it if I did. 3 incidents, 10 days. A town of 800 people that had managed to pass years without significant violence, suddenly faced with events that could not be individually explained and could not be collectively absorbed in the way that the previous shocks had been absorbed. The waiting capacity ran out. What followed was not rational, and it was not irrational either. It was something in between, which is the most dangerous territory for a community to occupy. People did not panic in the way of crowds running in one direction. They panic in the careful, specific, sustained way of people who have been taught to be afraid of attracting attention and who, therefore, direct their panic inward and sideways rather than outward. The mine workers who had been brought in from outside the region began to be looked at differently. Not confronted, confrontation under Securitate surveillance was not a viable option, but watched. Watched in a way that Varfol Negru had always watched, which was thorough and patient and left no record. Whether any of those workers had any connection to what had happened was something no one knew and no one could establish. But in the absence of any explanation, people assembled their own, and the assembled explanation pointed in the direction it had always been pointing. The older residents, the ones who had maintained the practices associated with the dome, de Piatra, even through the years when maintaining them meant doing so invisibly, became quietly central in a way they had not been for a generation. People who had dismissed those practices as embarrassments, who had been grateful that their children were growing up in a modern socialist state that did not traffic in that kind of superstition, found themselves at the doors of elderly relatives asking questions and listening to answers without their usual skeptical commentary. The ridge looked different to people during those weeks. Or perhaps more accurately, people looked at the ridge differently. The dark granite took on a quality that it did not have in summer, that it probably did not actually have at all, but that the community's collective attention had lent it. Small things were left at the base of the ridge. I know this because I was 8 years old at the time, and I remember my grandmother taking me with her one evening and placing something wrapped in cloth at the foot of a particular stone and saying words in a register of Romanian that I recognized as belonging to a much older version of a language than the one I used at school. She did not explain what she was doing in terms that an 8-year-old could fully process, and I did not ask her to. Something in the quality of the evening made asking feel inappropriate. The mine workers maintained their routines and their caution and gave no outward sign of being aware of the community's attention. The Securitate conducted their investigations into the community hall incident, which had given them more than enough to occupy themselves with. The medical services removed the father to their facility in the city. Elena Duma returned by degrees to her Sunday visits. Grigor Antal remained wherever Grigor Antal had been taken. And then, somewhere around the third week of March, the quality of the town's attention changed again. Not dramatically, not with any single event. The way that a fever breaks, not with a clear moment, but with a gradual recalibration that you only fully recognize in retrospect. People began to go to work again. Children returned to school. The Thursday market resumed its normal operations. The offerings at the base of the ridge were gradually discontinued as spring moved the snow back up the mountain and the valley opened to light for longer periods each day. I have thought about that period many times in the years since. I was too young to understand it while it was happening and old enough to have stored the memory of its texture. The particular quality of the air in our house during those weeks, the way my grandmother spoke in careful registers about careful topics, the absence of certain adults from certain places, the unusual pattern of evening visits between households that did not usually visit each other. It was only much later, when I was adult enough to ask questions and old enough to find people willing to answer them, that I assembled a picture of what that month in Varfol Negru had actually contained. What happened to Grigor Antal in his years away from the valley is not information I have entirely, and what I do have I will not summarize in a way that flattens it to fit neatly in a story. What happened in that house near the ridge on the Saturday afternoon of the third incident was similarly never explained to the satisfaction of anyone who investigated it, including the Securitate, who had considerably more resources for investigation than the town doctor did. The explanations that exist are the ones that communities construct when official explanations fail to arrive or fail to convince. They are built out of whatever materials are available. Old beliefs, local knowledge, the specific texture of a month that felt wrong in ways that were difficult to articulate and impossible to dismiss. They are not the explanations I would reach for myself. I'm a civil engineer. I believe in load-bearing structures and material tolerances and the behavior of matter under predictable conditions. But I also grew up in Varfol Negru, at the foot of a dark granite ridge, in a family that put things wrapped in cloth at the base of particular stones on cold March evenings, and said words in a language older than the state that was trying to make all such words illegal. And I think the most honest thing I can tell you is that both of those things are true simultaneously, that there are physical explanations for physical events and that there are things a community knows about itself that no physical explanation fully accounts for. The fault lines in that valley had been building pressure for a long time. When the release came, it was terrible and fast, and when it was over, the town was changed in ways that were difficult to measure, but impossible to ignore. Whatever you want to call that, collective psychology, mass tension, the inevitable consequences of prolonged oppression expressing themselves through individual acts. It happened there. I saw the edges of it as a child. The center of it, I've spent years reconstructing from the accounts of people who were old enough to stand in it and still remember what it felt like to stand there. The ridge is still dark. The valley still fills with shadow in the late afternoon. The salt mine still operates, smaller now and different in its ownership and its workforce. The Thursday market still runs. My grandmother still makes preserves and has strong opinions about food preparation and does not speak about March of 1987 unless I ask her directly. And sometimes not even then. Some things that happen in a small place stay in that place, turning slowly in the dark like something that hasn't yet decided what to become. There are places where nothing happens for so long that when something finally does, the community has no framework for processing it. The small port town of Brila, sitting on the wide curve of the Danube in eastern Romania, was precisely that kind of place through most of the 1990s. The communist period had ended, the factories were slowly emptying, young people were leaving for Bucharest or further, and the town existed in a state of gentle economic decline that produced its own particular rhythm. Quiet, slightly melancholy, predictable in the way that struggling places tend to become predictable. The most significant event in any given month was usually a flooding dispute between neighboring properties or an argument at the Saturday market that someone's cousin was still referencing 3 years later. We were not a town accustomed to real disruption, which is why what happened in the summer of 2003 left a mark on us that has never entirely faded. It began with a girl named Mirela. She was 14, the daughter of a mechanic and a woman who worked in the post office, and she had grown up on one of the older residential streets near the river embankment. She was described by her teachers as diligent and quiet, by her classmates as kind in the unremarkable way that genuinely kind people tend to be. Not performing kindness, but simply operating from it as a baseline. She walked home from school the same way every day, a route of perhaps 20 minutes through streets she had known her entire life. One afternoon in early June, she did not arrive home. She was found 2 hours later by a man walking his dog along the embankment path, barely conscious and in a condition that I will not describe in unnecessary detail, except to say that whoever had found her had done something that required not one, but 2 surgical procedures at the hospital in Galatz, to which she was airlifted after the local clinic determined that what she needed was beyond their capacity. The surgeon who performed the operations spoke to the assembled press the following morning outside the hospital's main entrance, and he is a man I have always respected for his composure and his professionalism. He managed approximately 4 sentences before he stopped, pressed his hand briefly over his eyes, and needed a full minute before he could continue. He delivered the rest of his statement, that the surgeries had been successful and that Mirela's life was not in danger, in a measured tone of someone who has decided that composure is a form of respect for the person they are describing. The press conference footage circulated widely in the days that followed, and I have never been able to watch more than a few seconds of it. The investigation was handed immediately to the county police, with assistance from the National Criminal Investigation Division, who sent 2 officers from Bucharest within 48 hours. Mirela's memory of the attack was incomplete in the way that severe trauma sometimes makes memories incomplete. She could provide fragments, impressions, directional information about where she had been when it happened, but nothing that assembled into a usable description of her attacker. The county investigators were thorough and visible, going door to door along the relevant streets, interviewing staff at the nearby businesses, making appeals through the local radio station and the regional newspaper. The school sent notices home. The community responded with the full force of a small town that has suddenly remembered how close together everyone lives and how little anyone actually knows about the person in the adjacent house. The paranoia that descended on Brilla in those weeks is difficult to describe to someone who has not experienced it. We were not a community that spent much time afraid of one another. The town had its tensions and its grudges. Every town does. But the working assumption had always been that the people you passed on the embankment and stood beside at the market were not dangerous in that particular way. That assumption simply evaporated. Men who had nodded to each other for 20 years across the fence found themselves looking at each other differently. Women who walked the same routes Mirella had walked began altering their paths. Parents drove their children to school and waited outside to collect them. The post office where Mirella's mother worked became a place people visited not just for their usual business, but to stand for a while near someone who was connected to what had happened, as though proximity to grief was also proximity to answers. The county investigators gave press updates every few days that said, in various careful formulations, that the investigation was ongoing and that they were following several active lines of inquiry. Whether this was true or a form of managed uncertainty to prevent the town's anxiety from becoming something worse, I cannot say from this distance. What I know is that 3 weeks passed and no arrest was made. The summer continued its ordinary business of heat and river light and the smell of the Danube. And somewhere inside it, Mirella was recovering and her attacker was unaccounted for. Then a man named Konstantin Viduva walked into his own house on a Tuesday evening and did something that ended the question of the attacker's whereabouts, though not in any way the investigators had planned for. Konstantin Viduva was 61 years old. He had operated a locksmith shop on the main commercial street for 32 years, having taken it over from his own father, and was known in Brilla with the particular familiarity that comes from being the person everyone calls when they have locked themselves out of something. He was a thin, precise man who wore a canvas apron in the shop and spoke in the careful, measured way of someone who has spent decades working with small mechanisms that require exactness. He attended the Orthodox church on the street behind his shop every Sunday, without exception. He was, in the estimation of everyone I have spoken to about him, not a man anyone would have predicted anything unusual from. His son Florin was 23. He had finished his military service the previous year and returned to Brilla without a clear plan, working occasionally at the port and occasionally helping his father in the shop, occupying the intermediate space between his former life and whatever came next with the slightly restless energy of young men in that particular position. He was not, by the accounts of people who knew him, anyone who drew much attention. He was considered pleasant enough in the superficial way of someone you see around without ever quite seeing. On that Tuesday evening, Konstantin came into the house after closing the shop. His wife Cornelia was in the kitchen. Florin was in the living room watching television. What happened in the next part of the evening is something that Cornelia has spoken about only once in a statement to the police and has not revisited publicly since. What is known is that Konstantin and Florin had a conversation that lasted approximately 20 minutes, during which Cornelia remained in the kitchen and heard the tone of the voices change but could not hear the specific words. She heard Konstantin's footsteps on the stairs, then a pause, then a single sound that she described to the investigators as not fitting into any category she had previously known. Then silence. She found Florin in the living room. Konstantin was seated in the chair by the window with his hands resting on his knees, looking at the opposite wall. The television was still on. Cornelia called the emergency number and then, in the particular dislocation of someone whose mind has separated from what their eyes are reporting, called her sister. It was the sister who called the police a second time and confirmed that someone needed to come immediately. The responding officers found Konstantin exactly as Cornelia had left him, in a chair, hands on his knees, watching the opposite wall with the particular quality of stillness that is different from ordinary stillness. He did not resist being led outside. He walked with the officers to their vehicle and sat in the back with the precise posture of a man attending to some interior process that required most of his concentration. At the station, he stated his name, his address, and his age. He described the sequence of events with a mechanical clarity that the investigating officer described afterward as the most orderly account he had taken from anyone in similar circumstances in 20 years of police work. He confirmed what weapon he had used and how. He said he was prepared to answer any further questions they had. The further questions were primarily about why. The investigators asked this from multiple directions over the course of the following day. Directly, indirectly, through the framing of other questions that approached the subject from the side, through suggestions offered as possibilities to be accepted or rejected. Konstantin Viduva declined each approach with the same quiet consistency. He stated that he had done what he did, that he accepted the consequences, and that he had nothing further to add on the question of motivation. He asked if he could be taken to the holding cell. He was taken to the holding cell. Officially, the case of Konstantin Viduva remains a homicide with an undisclosed motive. The county prosecutor's office processed the matter with appropriate thoroughness. Konstantin received a sentence commensurate with the charge. The investigation into Mirela's attack was formally maintained for another 14 months before being classified as inactive due to insufficient evidence. What Brila knows, which is a different category of knowledge from what the official record contains, is what everyone in the town had assembled within approximately 48 hours of Konstantin's arrest. The connection between the two events was not established by any investigative process. It was established by the particular collective intelligence of a small community that has been watching everyone in it for decades, and therefore holds information about relationships, patterns, and histories that no official file captures. People knew who Florin had been seen with and where and when. People remembered things that had not seemed significant individually, but that assembled into a picture once there was a frame to put them in. The question that remains genuinely unresolved, the one that Brila returns to in the particular way that communities return to things they cannot close, is how Konstantin found out. A father and a son had a conversation on a Tuesday evening. Something in that conversation moved a 61-year-old locksmith, a man of extreme precision and long habit and deep religious conviction, to do something that he must have known would end the life he had built over 6 decades. Whatever Florin said, or did not say, but was inferred, whatever passed between them in those 20 minutes while Cornelius stood in the kitchen and heard the register of voices change, was sufficient. There are theories. Some of them are plausible. Some of them reflect more about the people advancing them than about the event itself. None of them can be confirmed, and none of them have been denied by the one person who could deny them, who has maintained the same precise silence on this particular question in custody that he maintained in the chair at the police station on the night it happened. Brila has never fully returned to the working assumption it held before that summer, that the person beside you on the embankment is not dangerous in that particular way. The assumption is there in a modified form, slightly more provisional than it used to be, held with a small internal reservation that was not there before. Mirela, from what I have heard, recovered and moved away and built a life elsewhere. Whether she knows what happened to Florin Viduva, I cannot say. Whether knowing would mean anything to her is a question I am not in a position to answer. What I can tell you is that the locksmith shop on the main commercial street stood empty for 2 years after the summer of 2003 before someone else eventually took it over. The sign with the family name came down. The new owner changed the paintwork and rearranged the window display and operated the shop competently and without any connection to the history of the premises. Most people who pass it now have no particular association with it. But there are people in Brila who do, and when they pass it, they sometimes pause in the way that people pause when a physical location holds something they have never fully set down, and then they continue on their way, and the town continues its quiet life beside the wide curve of the Danube, where nothing much happens for long stretches, and then something happens all at once, and then the long stretches resume. In late March of 2003, when I was just 19 years old, I came home to find my mother sitting in the living room. I had spent the previous night at a friend's party with my girlfriend Layla at the time, and after one of my first real experiences with alcohol, I wasn't feeling my best. I walked through the front door into a house wrapped in complete silence and assumed my mother and sister were out, but when I headed toward the main room, I saw my mother sitting there motionless, staring into nothing, a cup of lukewarm tea in front of her. The scene was so strange that, through the haze of the previous night, I flinched when I spotted her. Then that surprise was quickly replaced by that familiar heaviness in the chest that comes when you're about to hear bad news. My mother never sat in rooms like that, silent as a statue. It wasn't like her at all. She asked me to sit down, and when I did, she told me that my father was gone and that he wasn't coming back. I asked if she meant he was dead. She shook her head slowly and said no. He left, just like that. I remember floating on a brief island of relief before sinking back into the depths of shock. And when I recovered my bearings, I peppered her with questions. How did she know? Where had he gone? When did he leave? And her answer to every single one was the same. I don't know. The harder she tried to say anything meaningful, the more she fell apart. He hadn't told her, hadn't left a note, hadn't said goodbye to anyone. He packed a single bag, got in his car, and drove off as though he were going to buy bread. The conversation ended with my mother in tears and me holding her, telling her everything was going to be okay. But I came to discover, unfortunately, that everything was not going to be okay. In the first 2 or 3 months, no one really talked about my father's disappearance in any real sense. There were visits from relatives and calls to check in on us, but the conversation centered on how we were doing, not on why he had left or whether he'd come back. Anything that brushed up against the mystery of it all tended to make my mother collapse to the point where she couldn't speak anymore. And I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel the same way. But once the initial shock wore off, a burning curiosity took the place of the pain and grief, one made far worse by my mother's deliberate and enduring silence on the subject. She wasn't in denial or anything, and people grieve in different ways, but whenever I brought up my father, she'd either burst into tears or explode in anger, shouting things like, "Don't you dare talk to me about that worthless man, he's dead to me." And so I had no choice but to seek answers elsewhere. Sensing that she was hiding something from me, I did so with great intensity. My first move was to contact Victor, my father's close friend, his only real friend, in fact. I figured he was the most likely to know anything about my father's whereabouts. My father was an only child, and both his parents had died before he turned 30, but he and Victor had been close since their university days, a friendship even longer than his marriage to my mother. I thought if anyone knew where my dad was, it'd be him. But when I called, Victor said my call was the first he'd heard of any of it. He had no idea why my father might have left, but he did know a few places he might have gone. And one of those places was a small village in northern Finland called Inari. I ruled out the possibility that my father had stayed in our city of Lyon in southern France, since he had stopped going to work. I then looked into his hometown of Toulouse, but as far as I could tell, he wasn't there either. And only then did I consider traveling all the way to Inari, the most distant of the 3 potential locations. That would mean crossing thousands of kilometers into the depths of northern Finland. Victor said my father had spent a summer there during his final year of university and had spent years longing to go back, often mentioning his wish to return one day. According to Victor, if something like a sudden midlife crisis had come over him, there was a good chance he had made his way to Inari. Inari, which sits roughly 300 kilometers from the nearest large city, has a population of around 7,000, the majority of whom are indigenous Sami people. There is 1 petrol station, 1 medical clinic, and the nearest police station is more than 150 kilometers away. It is the very definition of a remote town. But to me, that was good news because there'd be nowhere for my father to hide. I was warned against traveling in winter since temperatures can drop to -50 up there, so I made sure to plan the trip for summer. I arrived in Inari on Tuesday, July 16th, 2005, after 3 days of driving up from Lyon. There was no nearby hotel, and since I was only planning to stay for around 48 hours at most, I figured I could sleep in my car, which inadvertently led me to my first stop in town, the petrol station. Working there was a man named Oskari, who appeared to be in his 40s, with pale blonde hair and eyes the color of melted ice. He was warm and good-natured, and after some small talk he remarked on how rare it was to get any outsiders coming through. I took that as my golden opportunity and showed him the most recent photo of my father. He didn't recognize him, but when I showed him the second picture, one I had dug out from among my father's belongings, he stopped cold. It was an old photo from what must have been his university days. My father is a young man, standing beside a young woman, both in hiking gear on either side of a large rock, pointing to a strange mineral vein that ran straight through its center. Osprey recognized the rock immediately. He said it was the Blue Ice Rock, a natural landmark about 15 kilometers outside of town. It had stirred controversy in the 90s when geologists came down from Helsinki to study it. The oral tradition of the Sami held that it was the bone of a giant being that had fallen from the sky in ancient times. The arrival of the geologists ignited a sharp debate. Some locals were curious to learn the scientific truth, while others felt that subjecting the landmark to such scrutiny was a desecration of their ancestors' beliefs. The studies ultimately showed that the rock was neither a meteorite nor mythological remains, but the geologists estimated that it extended deep into the earth, possibly for more than a kilometer, and no one had any convincing explanation for how it had formed in land that showed no signs of volcanic activity. I mention all of this because I was deeply curious about why my father had visited that place. I had no memory of him ever showing any interest in geology. Then, as Osprey looked at the photo a second and third time with that fixed, concentrated stare, he asked if I knew who the woman was. I said no. He asked if I'd mind if he held onto the photo and made a quick call. He told me he was about 80% sure the woman in the photograph was the same one who had gone missing in the late 80s near the Great Lake of Inari, and that her face bore a striking resemblance to the one he had seen on missing persons posters as a child. He added that I should visit the local government office to be certain, and that it was located inside the medical clinic. Since I had arrived late in the afternoon, I was told the office would be closed until the following morning. I spent the rest of the day wandering the quiet town before returning to my car to sleep. The next morning, I stopped by the petrol station for coffee and something to eat, swapped a bit of small talk with Osprey, and then walked over to the clinic. There I met Eileen, the head of the local Sami Council. She laughed and told me the official title was grander than the job, and that it was almost entirely ceremonial. She welcomed me warmly, and from the look in her eyes, I knew straight away that she would be willing to help. But what she had to tell me was not what I had hoped to hear. Eileen, working out an office not much bigger than a closet, welcomed every rare visitor to the town and offered to answer any questions they might have. When I told her my story and showed her the old photograph, I watched her face shift from openness to a cold expression that bordered on something like fear. Then she said quietly, "I think we should step into my office." I sensed she possessed valuable information, the exact kind I had driven thousands of kilometers to find. But what she told me raised far more questions than it answered. Eileen told me that the woman in the photograph was named Anita Forsberg, a graduate of the University of Turku in 1989 who had disappeared in the summer of 1990 during a camping trip near the northern shores of Lake Inari. She then pointed to my father in the photo and told me that he had been one of the suspects detained and questioned by the police in connection with the disappearance. Not once, but twice. That was shocking in every sense of the word. And yet, this may sound strange, it was the first time in my entire search that I felt I was holding something solid. I had spent roughly 18 months running into blank walls and dead ends. So even if the news was bad, the knowledge that my father had once been a suspect in a disappearance meant there was a real thread I could follow. I thought, perhaps he had made a late-life pilgrimage back here, searching for answers about the girl he had once loved and lost. It would also explain my mother's violent, furious silence whenever my father came up, suggesting she had known something about Anita all along. Eileen then added that Anita Forsberg's remains had never been found, and that no one had ever been formally charged. She mentioned that Anita's last known location had been the area the Sami people called the Voaska Lands, a vast marshy expanse to the northeast of the lake, where police had found her tent in perfect condition, yet completely empty of any trace of its owner. Eileen glanced at the newer photo of my father and said she hadn't seen him in town, but quickly added that if he were heading straight for the Blue Ice Rock, there would be no real reason for him to pass through the village, especially if it held the painful memory of being arrested. If he wanted to search for Anita, or simply stand at the last place she was seen alive, it made sense that he would have gone directly to the Voaska Lands. The problem was that getting there from Inari meant covering about 250 kilometers of rough terrain. Without a capable four-wheel drive, which I obviously didn't have, there was no point attempting it. And even with one, a 40-kilometer hike through Voasca's marshland still awaited me at the end of the road. I turned the situation over in my mind. I could rent a 4x4, drive to a certain point, and then walk for days through punishing wilderness. But my finances were in a sorry state. I had already taken a full week off work, spent heavily on fuel, overnight stays, and food along the way. I had two choices: cut my losses and return at a later date, or call my mother and beg her to wire me some money, then call work and risk my job by asking for more days off after already putting my manager in a difficult position at short notice. But being up there in the north made me feel close in a way I couldn't explain. I told myself I wouldn't be able to live with the regret of turning back. In the end, I called my manager first. That was the easy one. I was honest with him. My father had disappeared, and I was up north trying to find him, hoping to bring him home. He said, "Take all the time you need." My mother, on the other hand, was anything but easy to convince. She didn't know where I was or what I was doing, and when I told her, she was furious. She refused to send money and told me to come home immediately. I spent over half an hour in a heated argument, full of tears and silence and words said in anger, using the phone in the petrol station's back office, before she finally relented and agreed to transfer money. I'll be forever grateful to Oskari for giving me that privacy during the call. It was quite possibly the most intense conversation I've ever had, and I owe Oskari something even greater than that. He was the one who agreed to drive me north toward the area near the Voasca lands, asking nothing in return but the cost of fuel. He had grown genuinely invested in my story, especially once I told him everything Eileen had said. But before we set off, he said something to me that I will carry to my dying day. He asked, "Your father went out looking for the girl. You went out looking for your father. Have you ever stopped to think about who's going to go looking for you?" A chill ran through me. I had never once given that a single thought, but the moment he said it, the words settled in my bones. On the drive north, Oskari's quiet practicality gradually talked me out of the idea of trekking into Voasca on foot. My father, at least, would have had basic camping gear if he intended to walk that far. I had no tent, no suitable clothing, no sufficient food. Instead, we decided to head to the nearest police station in the town of Sodankala to report my father's disappearance, leave my contact details, and hopefully learn more about what had happened to him and about his questioning in connection with Anita's case. The drive to Sodankala took about 4 hours. When we arrived, Oskari stopped at a grocery store while I went into the station alone. It was a small reception area with a larger room behind it. A young officer named Marty, about my age, traded a friendly greeting with me and seemed ready to help, but when he realized my inquiry went deeper than a routine question, he made a call to his senior colleague, Purdy, a pseudonym, and the reason for it will become clear shortly. The most experienced officer in the area. Purdy was older and more seasoned, and initially reserved, but he opened up gradually as I told him the full story. He said he remembered the Anita Forsberg case because he had been a junior officer at the time of the investigation. He remembered how my father had returned to town alone, how it was he who had reported Anita missing, and how the police had ultimately been left with no choice but to treat him as a suspect after the first round of questions. Purdy hadn't been present at either interview and didn't know how exactly my father had implicated himself, only that he had. He said all the files and reports were kept on site, but that he couldn't share them without official clearance, and that a Freedom of Information request could take months. He said, with a trace of weary irony, that he hadn't spent nearly 30 years on the job only to lose his pension over a slip like that. It was frustrating, but also strangely cathartic. Even though I had traveled so far, I wasn't going home completely empty-handed. Both Purdy and Marty promised to keep an eye out for my father and to contact me if they heard or saw anything in the area near the Voasca lands. Before I left, Purdy asked what my plans were. I told him I was heading back to Inari and would probably spend one more night in my car before driving south in the morning. He wished me luck, I thanked him, and then I walked outside to meet Oskari by his truck. He had picked up some sandwiches, and as I got back on the road to Inari, I gave him the full rundown of what the officers had told me. Oskari said he had been keeping me in his prayers, hoping I'd get my hands on those files sooner rather than later. I wouldn't call myself a religious person, not by any stretch, but sometimes I think Oskari's prayers found someone's ears. Because that night, as I was trying to get some sleep before the long drive back south, I was woken by a knock on my car window. When I looked outside, I saw a dark blue coat. It was Purdy. He gestured to me. I straightened my seat, opened the door, and invited him to sit in the passenger seat. When he climbed in, I saw him reach into his pocket and produce a small disc with a handwritten label I couldn't read in the dark. I had switched off the interior lights to save the battery, but I had a strong feeling it was something very specific, something he absolutely should not have been showing me. Purdy told me to open my laptop. I did. He slid the disc in, and my suspicions were confirmed. It was a scanned copy of the written transcript of my father's first interview, the one conducted before his arrest, when he was not yet considered a suspect. In that first interview, my father was candid and forthcoming. He said that he and Anita had been camping near the marshlands when he was woken by the sound of her leaving the tent in the night. Seconds later, he heard her scream. He pulled on his boots in a hurry, grabbed a torch, and ran out into the darkness to find what had frightened her so badly. And that, he said, was when he saw them. One of the interviewing officers asked, "Who are they?" My father replied that if he told them, they'd think he was out of his mind. He then said something to the effect that if he had known they were out there, he and Anita would never have gone anywhere near that place. Not in a million years. One of the officers asked where they had taken Anita Forsberg. My father said he didn't know, but wherever it was, she was most likely dead. She had to be, because there was no way she could have survived what they were doing to her. Again, the officers asked, "Who are they?" And my father exploded. He asked them how they didn't know. "You live out here," he said, and other things that sounded completely unhinged. So much so that it was no wonder the officers concluded he had killed Anita Forsberg. The officers continued with a few more questions, but with each answer my father grew more and more agitated. He didn't know why they hadn't taken him too. He hadn't noticed anyone following them in the days before. And he couldn't explain why there wasn't a single drop of Anita's blood anywhere, despite his insistence that a violent attack had taken place. After that, the officers announced they were terminating the interview, and the transcript ended. When I asked Purdy whether he had brought the second file, he shook his head and said it wasn't worth reading. He explained that following what my father had said in the first session, the police had placed him under arrest on suspicion of Anita's murder. And in the second interview, once my father realized the officers didn't believe his account, he said nothing at all. He stayed completely silent until he was released for lack of evidence. He left town after his release and never came back. The search for Anita continued for 10 days. The team found a shared campsite intact, but with no trace of the girl. No clothing, no blood, no human remains. The search was eventually called off, and years later Anita's parents had her officially declared dead for legal purposes, and her name was removed from the missing persons register. But Purdy added a detail that had always stayed with him. Near the end of the search operation, one of the police dogs broke free of its handler and vanished entirely. The dog's disappearance triggered a secondary search within the larger effort. Officers combed the area high and low for both Anita Forsberg and the missing hound. Neither was ever found. The dog's fate was officially recorded as an operational hazard, mourned, then replaced. But Purdy was convinced there was far more to it than a dog getting overexcited and drowning in a marsh. He closed by sharing his personal theory. In his view, my father and Anita had stumbled across some kind of cultivation site, possibly drugs, and my father's volatile outbursts during the first interview were a reaction to that. He was quick to add that he had no proof whatsoever, but that very little else explained some of what my father had said. After Purdy left, I lay back into a restless and unsettled sleep. It was strange hearing my father as a young man. He sounded a lot like me whenever I hear my own voice on a recording. But that, of course, is not what stayed with me through the night. It was what he said, and how he said it. On the drive back, I carried with me a strange tangle of sadness and fear. I had never felt so close to finding my father, and at the same time, he had never felt so distant. All his life, he had probably been carrying the weight of what happened in that Finnish marsh. I can't speak for my mother, because I still don't know how much she knew. But I had known nothing at all, until that moment. That was almost 2 years ago now. I'm writing this in December 2007. I'm still no closer to the full truth about my father's disappearance. But today I have a much clearer sense of where to look, and now that I can hold my own on a solo hiking trip, I think I'm just about ready to go looking for him. I'm planning to head back north in the coming summer, perhaps in July, and I'll write up everything I find. I don't know how many of you will read this, but I'm not really writing for anyone else. I'm writing for my own sanity. And when I find out anything new, this will be the first place I post. I expect to publish another entry in a few months. And if I don't, well, either I found my father or something else happened. I suppose we'll all just have to wait and see.